Hey everyone! Tonight, we're diving into some incredible true stories, from medieval peasants surviving brutal winters, to lost ancient cities, and revolutions that changed the world. If you enjoy deep dives into history's hidden moments, make sure to subscribe and hit the bell so you don't miss what's next. I'd also love to hear from you. Drop a comment below telling me where you're watching from and what time it is for you. Let's see how far this community reaches. Now, get comfortable. Dim the lights. Let's begin. The unforgiving cold.
Before electricity painted the night with artificial light, before smartphones pulsed blue in darkened bedrooms, before the very concept of sleep hygiene entered human vocabulary, our ancestors experienced the darkness in ways that would bewilder the modern mind. The medieval relationship with sleep was not merely different from our own, it was fundamentally alien, shaped by rhythms of nature, fear of the unseen, and a spirituality that permeated every waking and sleeping moment. The most striking feature of medieval slumber was its segmentation. This was not sleep as we know it, a solid block of unconsciousness grudgingly surrendered to before the alarm's tyranny. Instead, medieval people practiced what historians now call biphasic or segmented sleep, a natural rhythm that divided the night into two distinct periods separated by an hour or two of wakefulness. After sundown, as darkness swallowed the landscape and the day's labor finally ceased, most people would retire to their beds, drifting into what was known as first sleep. This initial slumber lasted approximately 4 hours, after which something remarkable happened: they would wake up deliberately. Not from disturbance, not from anxiety, but simply because this was how sleep worked. The body knew the rhythm, and the rhythm was as natural as breathing. This waking period, referred to in medieval texts as the watch, was not considered insomnia or a sleep disorder. It was simply the interval between sleeps, a space in the night when the world grew quiet enough for thinking, praying, and the kind of quiet productivity that daytime chaos made impossible. People would rise from their beds, light candles if they could afford them, and tend to various tasks. Some would pray, reading religious texts by flickering flame. Others would check on the fire, ensuring the embers would last until morning. Farmers might step outside to verify their livestock remained secure, because nothing disrupts the sleep cycle quite like wondering if your goat has wandered off or been taken by wolves. This was also considered the ideal time for intimacy. Medieval physicians and marriage manuals noted that the body was well rested yet calm during this period, the mind quiet after first sleep but not yet burdened by the coming day's responsibilities. It was, as one might delicately put it, a time when couples were too tired to argue but rested enough for other pursuits. Following this interlude, people would return to sleep for their second sleep, which lasted until dawn's first light crept through shuttered windows. This rhythm was universal across medieval society: monks in their monasteries, peasants in their cottages, nobles in their castle chambers all followed the same pattern dictated by darkness and biology. Even literary figures like Geoffrey Chaucer casually referenced this sleep pattern in their works, meaning that medieval literature, like modern media, contained its fair share of references to not sleeping properly. The consistency of these references across historical documents suggests that segmented sleep was not merely common but expected, as natural as hunger or thirst. What makes this particularly fascinating is that modern sleep science has suggested that biphasic sleep might actually be more natural for human physiology than our contemporary 8-hour compression. In laboratory conditions where subjects are deprived of artificial light, they naturally revert to segmented sleep patterns. The two-sleep cycle aligns with how our circadian rhythms operate when unperturbed by electric lighting, screen blue light, and the industrial demand for consolidated rest. It was only with the Industrial Revolution, with factories demanding synchronized labor, gas lamps extending the workday, and a growing cultural anxiety about productivity, that humans began enforcing the idea of 8 uninterrupted hours. Sleep became a timed sport rather than a natural rhythm, and those who woke in the night were pathologized as insomniacs rather than recognized as following their ancestral patterns. So the next time you find yourself wide awake at 2 a.m., staring at the ceiling and wondering what cosmic joke has been played upon your rest, remember the medieval wisdom. That wakefulness is not failure, it is the watch. The time between sleeps when your ancestors tended their fires, said their prayers, and contemplated their place in a universe that felt both vast and intimately present. You are not broken. You are simply experiencing the night as humans have for most of our existence. The beds upon which medieval people experienced their segmented sleep bear almost no resemblance to the carefully engineered sleep surfaces of the modern world. Today we obsess over thread counts, memory foam density, cooling gel technology, and whether a mattress achieves the perfect balance between cloud-like softness and orthopedic support. Medieval Europeans would have found such concerns incomprehensible, not because they didn't value comfort, but because comfort was an aspirational luxury rather than an expected baseline. The typical peasant bed was what they called a pallet, a mattress stuffed with straw or hay, if one was fortunate enough to possess a sack to contain it. If no sack existed, the straw simply lay on the floor, arranged into a rough sleeping nest that might be slightly elevated from the coldest drafts. This straw was cheap, plentiful, and reasonably effective at insulating against the cold that seeped through stone walls and earthen floors. It was also remarkably effective at harboring insects, lice, and the occasional field mouse who found the warm, sheltered space equally appealing. Sleeping on such a surface required a particular philosophy of rest. You did not expect stillness or comfort. You expected the rustle of straw with every movement, the persistent itch of tiny occupants you could not see, the occasional sharp nip that you learned to ignore through necessity. If something bit you, you shifted slightly and hoped for the best. If the rustling grew too persistent, you might sigh and accept that sleep would come when it came. Families with slightly more resources might elevate their straw mattress onto a simple wooden frame. This modest elevation did not dramatically improve the sleeping experience. The straw remained prickly, the insects remained present, but it did reduce the chances of waking with beetles in your ear, which represented a genuine quality of life improvement worth the investment. Linens were a rare luxury reserved for those of comfortable means. Most people slept in the clothes they had worn throughout the day, since pajamas as a concept had not yet been invented, and changing for sleep would have required having multiple sets of clothing, an extravagance beyond most households. Personal space was similarly absent from medieval sleeping arrangements. Entire families, parents, children, grandparents, perhaps a servant or two, slept together in the same room, often on the same pile of straw. If you grew too warm, you could always roll into your cousin's elbow. If you grew too cold, you pressed closer to whoever was nearest, regardless of their willingness to serve as a heating source. For the nobility, sleep was an entirely different experience. Their beds featured large wooden frames, sometimes elaborately carved, supporting feather mattresses that would have seemed impossibly luxurious to the peasant sleeping on straw. Embroidered sheets and heavy blankets provided warmth and comfort, while canopies served the dual purpose of trapping heat and protecting against drafts from poorly sealed windows and walls. These beds were so valuable that they were frequently mentioned in wills, passed down through generations like other precious heirlooms. You might not inherit land or titles, but you might receive your grandmother's feather bed, lumpy from decades of use, perhaps, but still a treasure beyond price. Yet even noble beds carried their own challenges. Feather mattresses required maintenance and eventually grew musty. Canopies trapped warmth but also provided excellent hiding places for insects. And no amount of wealth could entirely eliminate the persistent presence of vermin that plagued every medieval household, regardless of social standing. For most medieval people, then, a bed was not a place of comfort or relaxation. It was a place to not freeze during the long winter nights. It was a place to avoid the chickens that might otherwise roost on your chest. It was a place to dream, perhaps, of being rich enough to one day sleep on something that didn't rustle with every movement or squawk when accidentally disturbed. The bed was functional rather than luxurious, necessary rather than desirable, and in that functionality, it shaped how medieval people experienced the fundamental human need for rest. When modern people hear the phrase, nightcap, they typically imagine a warm alcoholic beverage consumed before bed, perhaps with whiskey and honey, accompanied by a crackling fire and the pleasant anticipation of drowsiness. But in the medieval world, a nightcap was exactly what the words described, a cap worn at night, a tangible piece of fabric designed to solve one of the era's most persistent sleeping problems. Medieval architecture was not known for its insulating properties. Stone walls conducted cold rather than blocking it. Thatched roofs, while picturesque, allowed drafts to whistle through with enthusiasm. Windows, when they existed, were covered with thin animal horn or oiled parchment that did little to stop the penetration of winter's chill. Central heating was a concept that would not exist for centuries. The closest approximation was called a dog, and even that required an animal willing to share your bed. Under these conditions, keeping warm during sleep required every available strategy. And since body heat escapes most rapidly through the scalp, a fact medieval people understood through experience if not through scientific measurement, covering the head became essential for maintaining any semblance of warmth through the night. Thus the humble night cap became an essential piece of sleeping equipment. These hats came in various shapes and sizes, but the most iconic version was long and pointed, resembling something one might expect on a wizard who moonlighted as a chimney sweep. Made from wool, linen, or whatever fabric could be spared from other uses without angering the family members who might need it for clothing, these caps trapped warmth against the head and prevented the escape of precious body heat. For men, the night cap was purely practical, a functional accessory worn without ceremony or meaning beyond its thermal properties. For women, the situation was more complex. Many women wore a coif or head wrap that served the same warming function while also maintaining the modesty expected of married women, who were often required to cover their hair at all times, including during sleep. These coverings could be embroidered or dyed to reflect family wealth and status, because nothing says success quite like going to bed with what amounts to a small flag on your skull announcing your social position even in unconsciousness. In more urban settings, the night cap acquired additional social meaning. It became a symbol of being off duty, of having retired from the day's business and entered the private realm of home and rest. If you opened your door wearing a night cap, it was a polite medieval way of indicating that you were not dressed for conversation and that visitors should return at a more appropriate hour. The cap said, without words, "I am not available for business or social calls. Please go away and let me return to my rest." Night caps were typically paired with night shirts, long, loose tunics that covered the body and provided additional warmth. These garments resembled nothing so much as the nightclothes of Ebenezer Scrooge in Victorian depictions, minus the haunted moral lessons. They were not designed to be attractive or alluring. They were designed to be practical, warm, and, if one was unlucky enough to sleep near an open flame, occasionally flammable. The entire ensemble of medieval sleepwear represented a fundamentally different approach to the night than modern people take. We undress for sleep, removing the clothing of the day and replacing it with specialized garments designed for comfort and often for visual appeal. Medieval people, by contrast, added layers for sleep, covering their heads and bodies with additional fabric rather than removing what they already wore. This difference reflects not just practical considerations of warmth but a different relationship with the body, with privacy, and with the very meaning of rest. The modern expectation of sleeping alone or with a single partner is a relatively recent luxury, made possible by central heating, spacious housing, and cultural shifts toward privacy as a value. In medieval Europe, sleeping alone was not merely unusual, it was considered suspicious, impractical, and potentially dangerous. Imagine you are a traveling merchant making your way between towns, or a pilgrim journeying to a distant shrine, or simply someone whose mule has given up halfway to your destination. You find an inn, itself a rare luxury in many regions, and ask for a place to sleep. What you receive is not a private room, not even a bed to yourself, but rather a spot in a bed that is already occupied by strangers. Medieval inns operated more like modern youth hostels than hotels, but with considerably less privacy and considerably more strangers. If a bed had space, you shared it, typically with 2, 3, or even 4 other travelers, depending on the bed's size and the collective tolerance for close quarters. This was not considered rude or unusual. It was simply efficient use of resources in a world where space was limited and travelers were many. These sleeping arrangements meant that you might share a bed with people who snored, who talked in their sleep, who had visible skin conditions, or who simply smelled unfortunate after weeks of travel without bathing facilities. You did not complain about these circumstances because there was no alternative and because everyone else was in the same situation. Snoring contests went unjudged. Elbow territory was fiercely but silently contested. Personal space was not a concept that applied to sleeping arrangements. Some inns attempted to assign beds by profession or social status, blacksmiths with blacksmiths, clergy with clergy, merchants with other merchants. In theory, this provided some measure of compatibility. In practice, it often meant that you simply shared a bed with people who did similar work, regardless of whether you found their company congenial. The alternative to this crowded arrangement was sleeping outdoors, which carried its own risks. Wolves still roamed many parts of medieval Europe. Weather could turn deadly. And the roads were not safe for solitary travelers after dark. Sharing a bed with strangers, however uncomfortable, was vastly preferable to sleeping under the stars with only your cloak for protection and only your wits to defend against whatever might emerge from the darkness. Concerns about theft naturally accompanied these arrangements. Travelers typically slept with their purses tied to their belts or hidden beneath their clothing, maintaining physical contact with their valuables throughout the night. Others slept on top of their bundles, transforming their luggage into both pillow and alarm system. If someone moved your bag, you would likely wake up, hopefully before losing your possessions. The wealthy, of course, avoided these indignities. Nobles traveled with entourages large enough to commandeer in space or camped in relative comfort with their own bedding and servants. They might demand private rooms if an innkeeper valued both their patronage and the continued existence of their establishment. But for the vast majority of medieval people, sleeping arrangements were communal by necessity rather than choice. This communal sleeping had psychological effects beyond the merely practical. In a world where the night was genuinely frightening, filled with unseen dangers both natural and supernatural, having others nearby provided comfort and protection. The darkness pressed against windows and crept through cracks, but surrounded by sleeping bodies, one could at least feel less alone in facing it. In the medieval world, going to bed was not merely a matter of pulling up blankets and drifting off. It was a spiritual operation, a nightly gamble with stakes that could not be higher. Your eternal soul hung in the balance between sunset and dawn. People did not simply sleep. They prepared to potentially die. Hence the extraordinary popularity of bedtime prayers, which were not gentle affirmations for peaceful rest but rather desperate negotiations with divine power, last-minute insurance policies against the very real possibility of not waking up. Forget lavender spray or calming bedtime routines. Medieval sleepers wound down with confessions, psalms, and soul-cleansing spiritual clauses designed to cover all possible theological contingencies between good night and good morning. The underlying logic was simple and terrifying: you could die at any moment. Death might come through illness, through accident, through fire, through demons, or through the simple statistical reality that life expectancy in the year 1247 was not what it is today. Given this uncertainty, you would be well advised to say your prayers, not because prayer was comforting, but because hell was genuinely terrifying, and you did not want to arrive at its gates spiritually unprepared. The most famous survival of this bedtime theology is the child's prayer that many still know: "Now I lay me down to sleep, I pray the Lord my soul to keep. If I should die before I wake, I pray the Lord my soul to take." This verse sounds sweet to modern ears, a gentle rhyme for teaching children about faith. In its medieval context, however, it was essentially a legal document drafted by a 7-year-old acknowledging death as a likely bedtime outcome. The prayer did not say, "If I might possibly die," but rather, "If I should die," a recognition that mortality was not an abstraction but a nightly possibility. Adults had even more elaborate prayer routines. Many maintained whole catalogs of prayers for different spiritual threats. One prayer for when you felt particularly guilty about the day's sins. Another for when you suspected the devil might be lurking in the rafters, waiting to claim your soul during the vulnerable hours of sleep. A third for plague prevention, which unfortunately aged poorly as plagues continued regardless of prayer. Some prayed to specific saints known for watching over sleepers, holy guardians who functioned as spiritual bouncers, protecting your soul at the door of unconsciousness. The truly devout, monks, nuns, and those lay people with particularly anxious spiritual dispositions, ended their days with Compline, the final prayer service of the monastic schedule. After Compline, participants took a vow of silence until morning. This was not particularly difficult, since everyone was already exhausted, often underfed, and mildly terrified of the darkness pressing against the chapel windows. Silence came naturally when your throat was dry from chanting and your mind was focused on avoiding damnation. Children were also encouraged to pray before bed, partly because it was good for their souls and partly because it gave them something to do other than asking inconvenient questions about why the family goat was sleeping in their bed again. Parents reminded their children that angels were watching over them through the night, a thought that sounds adorable until you recognize that it was less about guardian angels and more about establishing a celestial surveillance system designed to keep children on their best behavioral behavior even in sleep. In essence, prayer before sleep was less about peace and more about last-minute damage control. Think of it as medieval antivirus software for the soul. You hoped it would protect you from spiritual threats, even if you did not fully understand how it worked. And in the morning, when you woke to find yourself still alive and apparently undamned, you offered thanks and prepared to do it all over again the following night. In the modern world, dreams are typically dismissed as random neurological noise, the brain's way of processing information, working through stress, or simply generating meaningless imagery while the body rests. Eat too much cheese before bed, the folk wisdom suggests, and you will have strange dreams. It is all very mundane, very biological, very unremarkable. In the medieval world, dreams were taken with deadly seriousness. They were not random neurological events but messages, communications from God, from saints, from the devil, from your guardian angel, or possibly from that weird relic you kissed at the cathedral last Sunday. Dreams carried meaning, and ignoring that meaning could have eternal consequences. The theological understanding of dreams was complex and often contradictory. Some dreams were considered divine revelations, direct communications from God intended to guide, warn, or instruct the dreamer. Other dreams were demonic temptations, snares set by the devil to corrupt the innocent through seemingly innocent nighttime imagery. Either way, you were supposed to pay attention to your dreams and, depending on their content, either write them down for spiritual guidance, confess them to a priest, or fast for 3 days just to be safe. Theologians, monks, and self-proclaimed visionaries spent enormous amounts of time interpreting dreams, developing elaborate systems for decoding the symbolic language of sleep. Entire texts were dedicated to dream interpretation, offering guidance on what various images might signify. Dream of fire? That might represent hellfire and damnation. Dream of water? Could mean purification and spiritual cleansing, or could mean drowning in sin, depending on context. Dream of a man with a goat's head juggling fish? You should probably call a priest immediately and consider moving to a different town. This intense focus on dream interpretation reflected a fundamental belief about human nature. Medieval people believed that the soul remained active during sleep, traveling, experiencing, and sometimes sinning while the body rested. This meant that your actions in dreams could reveal hidden sins or spiritual weaknesses that your waking mind successfully suppressed. That mildly embarrassing dream about stealing a loaf of bread? That might actually be your subconscious confessing real-world guilt about gluttony or theft, or it might just reflect that you went to bed hungry. But better to confess it anyway, just in case. Monks and nuns often recorded their dreams and shared them with spiritual superiors, treating their nighttime experiences as seriously as their waking prayers. Some were celebrated for having holy visions during sleep, their dreams interpreted as evidence of special divine favor. Others were quietly advised to eat fewer onions before bed, their strange dreams attributed to digestive disturbance rather than spiritual insight. Dreams also served as excellent literary devices. Medieval literature is filled with dream sequences in which knights encounter angels, demons, or allegorical creatures who spout poetry about virtue and vice. These dream visions allowed authors to explore complex theological and philosophical ideas while maintaining plausible deniability about their sources. After all, it was just a dream. Dreams were essentially the Netflix of the medieval world, providing entertainment, moral instruction, and the occasional plot twist, all with more allegory and fewer happy endings than modern audiences might prefer. The Church maintained a predictably suspicious attitude toward dreams. Not all dreams were divine, and some were believed to be planted by demons specifically to corrupt the innocent. If you dreamed of something unwholesome, it could mean your soul was under attack, or it could simply mean you had slept too close to the fireplace and inhaled fumes that affected your brain. Distinguishing between these possibilities required spiritual discernment, and preferably consultation with someone trained in such matters. In modern times, allowing pets to sleep in the bed is a matter of personal preference, a cozy if occasionally smelly arrangement that some people embrace and others reject. In the Middle Ages, however, sharing a bed with animals was not a quirky lifestyle choice. It was a survival strategy. Medieval homes were not designed for comfort. Stone walls conducted cold. Roofs leaked. Windows, when they existed, provided minimal insulation against the elements. Drafts were so aggressive and persistent that they probably had names, recognized as distinct personalities that visited each winter. Central heating did not exist except in the form of the family pig, which generated body heat through its mere presence. In peasant homes, it was entirely normal for humans and livestock to share sleeping space. Not just the same room, the same bed, or more commonly the same pile of straw. Chickens wandered freely through living quarters and might settle near sleeping humans for warmth. Dogs curled up at their owner's feet, providing insulation against the cold floor. Pigs snorted softly beside the hearth, their substantial bodies radiating heat that could raise the temperature of an entire room by a degree or two. This arrangement was not about affection, though medieval people certainly valued their animal companions. It was about survival, pure and simple. Animals generated body heat. They were warm, dependable, and unlike some human relatives, they did not hog the blanket. A large dog could literally save your toes from freezing on the coldest winter nights. A cow in the corner of the room might make the difference between surviving the night and succumbing to exposure. Medieval homes, especially those of the lower classes, typically consisted of a single room used for everything: cooking, eating, sleeping, socializing, and occasionally dying. There was no separate bedroom, no distinction between human space and animal space. Everyone, humans and animals alike, made do with the same limited square footage. Children might be nestled between their parents and the family goat. A chicken might roost on the bed frame, serving as an impromptu alarm clock when dawn approached. Hygiene was not a consideration, or rather, hygiene was understood as something that mattered far less than not freezing to death. For wealthier families, this arrangement was less common. Nobles did not typically sleep next to livestock, though they might have lap dogs in bed, not primarily for warmth, but for fashion and, perhaps, for flea redistribution. Some castles even had separate sleeping areas for favorite animals, because nothing says power quite like a dog with its own room and possibly a minor title. There were obvious drawbacks to sleeping with animals. Animals could be loud, waking you at odd hours with their movements or vocalizations. They could wander, stepping on faces and stealing blankets. And they were not, historically speaking, known for respecting personal space. A hoof in the face at 3 a.m. was just part of the bedtime routine, annoying, perhaps, but not worth complaining about when the alternative was freezing. This intimate relationship with animals during sleep reflected a broader medieval understanding of the boundary between human and animal. It was more permeable than modern people might assume, less rigidly defined. Animals were part of the household, part of the family in a functional sense if not an emotional one. They contributed to survival, and in return, they shared the warmth of the fire and the protection of the roof. The arrangement was practical, mutual, and entirely unremarkable to those who lived it. If you have ever shared a room at a youth hostel and thought the experience somewhat lacking in comfort, allow me to introduce you to the medieval monastic dormitory, a place where comfort went to die quietly, presumably under a vow of silence. Monasteries did not believe in personal space, or softness, or fun, or any of the small comforts that make human existence bearable. The typical dormitory housed dozens of monks in a single large room, arranged in neat rows like morally upright sardines packed into a tin of piety. Beds, if one could call them that, consisted of wooden planks, sometimes topped with a straw mattress if the abbot was feeling generous or if a major feast day warranted special indulgence. Monks slept fully clothed, not primarily for modesty, but because getting dressed in the dark at 2 a.m. for prayers was more painful than simply going to bed already prepared. The monastic uniform, consisting of robe, belt, and sandals, doubled as spiritual armor and provided whatever insulation the wearer could manage. If you got cold, you layered up with whatever additional fabric you possessed. If you got hot, well, the concept of being too warm in a medieval stone building was largely theoretical. There were no pillows in the modern sense. There were no privacy curtains, no reading lights, no comfortable reading materials. There was enforced silence, not suggested, not encouraged, but enforced under the rule of Saint Benedict, which governed monastic life with considerable specificity. If you rolled over and groaned too loudly, you might find yourself assigned to chamber pot duty for a week, a punishment that combined physical unpleasantness with social humiliation. Snoring occupied a theological gray area. You could not consciously control it, which suggested it might not be a sin. But if your snoring disrupted the sleep of your fellow monks, the Lord might still hold you accountable, or at the very least, your cellmates would. The distinction between sin and annoyance was not always clear in practice. Lighting in the dormitory was minimal, one candle, perhaps, if the monastery could afford wax rather than cheaper, smokier tallow. You did not need to see anything beyond the basic outlines of your sleeping space. You simply needed to lie still and not sin, which was surprisingly difficult when you were cold, uncomfortable, and aware that you would be awakened in a few hours for prayers. Despite this austerity, or perhaps because of it, monks believed that their Spartan sleeping arrangement served a spiritual purpose. These uncomfortable beds were training for the afterlife, preparation for the soul's journey by denying the flesh any hint of excess or comfort. Sleep was not a pleasure to be sought but a necessity to be endured, monitored, and scheduled like every other aspect of monastic existence. Some particularly ascetic monks even slept sitting up, propped against walls or on specially designed benches, to avoid any possibility of comfort, or dreams, or healthy circulation. Compared to this disciplined discomfort, the peasant's straw pile shared with snoring pigs almost seemed luxurious. At least the pig did not judge you for your spiritual failings while you tried to rest. At least the pig did not wake you at 2 a.m. for prayers, unless you counted the occasional snort as a form of divine calling. Let us now consider something that would horrify most modern sleepers: waking up voluntarily at 2 a.m., not for a bathroom break or to check your phone, but for prayer. Loud, cold, candlelit prayer conducted in a stone chapel while your body desperately wished it could remain in whatever warmth your bed provided. In medieval monasteries, this was standard practice. Monks and nuns followed a rigid daily schedule based on the canonical hours, which divided the day and night into 8 prayer periods. The first of these, matins, occurred in the deepest part of the night, the hour when even the owls were still deciding whether it was worth waking up. The bell would toll, typically rung by whoever had drawn the short straw the previous evening, and the entire dormitory of robed, sleep-deprived souls would shuffle silently to the chapel. They moved in silence because the rule demanded it, and they moved in full clothing because changing would have required both time and energy that no one possessed at that hour. Monks did not do pajamas. The only layering system they believed in was spiritual rather than physical. Inside the chapel, by the light of flickering candles and beneath the echo of stone vaults that amplified every sound, they would chant psalms, recite scriptures, and attempt with varying degrees of success not to fall asleep standing up. Falling asleep during matins was a genuine occupational hazard, and monastic records contain accounts of monks being punished for dozing mid-prayer. The punishment typically involved extra chores or, ironically, more prayers. You fell asleep during matins? Congratulations, you now get to lead the next one. Matins could last an hour or more. Some particularly enthusiastic monastic orders stretched it to 2 hours, testing the limits of human endurance and spiritual commitment. Imagine trying to stay spiritually engaged while your stomach reminded you that dinner had been a bowl of lentils accompanied by a moral lesson, while your eyes burned with exhaustion, while your body actively attempted to shut down in protest. After the service, monks would either return to bed for their second sleep, the natural conclusion of the segmented sleep pattern, or, in stricter orders, move directly into study or manual labor. Because nothing says holy discipline quite like threshing wheat on 4 hours of fragmented rest, your body aching and your mind still half entangled in whatever dreams you had managed before the bell called you to prayer. Why so early? The idea behind this punishing schedule was to sacrifice comfort and dedicate the first and quietest part of the night to God, uninterrupted by the temptations of daylight, the distractions of warmth, or the seductive pull of REM cycles. It was a powerful symbol of devotion, a demonstration that spiritual obligations took precedence over physical needs. Or at least it felt that way once you got over the numb feet, the candle smoke in your eyes, and Brother Ambrose's persistent off-key chanting, which seemed designed to test everyone's patience as much as their piety. In the modern world, sleeping alone is often framed as a luxury, a sign of independence, of having achieved sufficient space and resources to claim a room for yourself, of being able to control the blankets without negotiation. In the medieval world, however, sleeping alone was considered suspicious, impractical, and potentially unsafe. Let us begin with the practical consideration of warmth. Beds, as we have established, were not exactly toasty. Stone walls and open windows did little to trap heat, and central heating remained several centuries away. People shared beds for body heat, not out of intimacy or affection, but out of basic thermal desperation. Children slept with siblings, with parents, and occasionally with visiting neighbors' children, creating sleeping arrangements that resembled sleepovers but without anyone asking whether you wanted to be there. Beyond the practical need for warmth, however, there was a spiritual dimension to communal sleeping that modern people might not immediately recognize. Many medieval people believed that the night was when the devil did his most effective work. Alone in the dark, separated from the protective presence of other humans, your soul was vulnerable to temptation, attack, or worse, possession. Having others nearby created a kind of moral buffer zone, a collective spiritual defense against the forces that prowled in darkness. If something went wrong, if demons appeared, if you were tempted beyond your capacity to resist, at least someone would witness it, or perhaps catch the demon before it could do lasting damage. There was safety in numbers, both physical and spiritual. For children, sleeping alone was practically unthinkable. Not just because they might be frightened, but because ghosts, fairies, and wandering spirits were all understood as genuine components of the nightly landscape. Folk tales warned against solitary sleep as a gateway to mischief and spiritual peril, and unlike modern bedtime stories, these tales did not end in hugs and reassurances. They ended in disappearances, in transformations, in children stolen away to fairy realms from which no return was possible. Even married couples typically shared their beds with children, servants, or random guests who happened to need a place to sleep. Privacy was not a concept so much as a modern myth, an invention of later centuries when houses grew larger and individualism grew stronger. In fact, the idea of two people sleeping alone in a giant bed was so foreign to medieval thinking that it would have been considered either wasteful, all that empty space, or deeply suspicious. Why would anyone want to sleep alone unless they had something to hide, something they did not want witnessed even in sleep? In religious contexts, even monks slept communally, as we have seen. And if someone was assigned to sleep alone, it was often for disciplinary reasons. Solitary sleep was punishment, a removal from the protective community of sleeping bodies that might guard against temptation. In some cases, being alone in bed was literally a penance imposed for spiritual failings. The logic was consistent: solitary sleep grants opportunity for sin, whether through dreams, through temptations resisted without witnesses, through the simple fact of being unobserved. Group sleep provides public accountability, even in unconsciousness. You cannot sin quite so easily when someone might wake at any moment and catch you in the act, even if the act in question is only a particularly vivid dream. Next time you curl up in your own bed with your own blankets in a room that does not smell faintly of livestock, take a moment to appreciate the silence and the solitude. In medieval times, you would probably have 2 children, a sheepdog, and a cousin in there with you, all of them snoring and none of them concerned with your preference for personal space. That if you have ever accidentally fallen asleep sitting up, in a lecture hall, on a long train journey, in a dentist's waiting room, you likely woke with a crick in your neck, a sense of deep regret, and a determination never to repeat the experience. In the Middle Ages, however, sleeping upright was not an accident. It was a deliberate lifestyle choice. Some medieval people, particularly among the wealthy or the religiously devout, chose to sleep propped up rather than lying flat. This was not a matter of falling asleep in an inconvenient position and being too tired to move. It was a conscious decision supported by pillows, bolsters, and specially designed furniture. Why would anyone choose to sleep upright? The answers reveal much about medieval medical theory and spiritual concerns. First, there was a medical belief that lying flat was bad for digestion, for the lungs, and for the general balance of the bodily humors that governed health according to Galenic medicine. In a world where physicians believed that a sneeze could rearrange your soul's relationship with your body, this logic made perfect sense. Upright sleeping, they believed, helped prevent congestion of the brain, a phrase that sounds ominous but basically meant you would not drown in your own phlegm during the night. Second, and perhaps more significantly, there were spiritual concerns about the posture of sleep. Lying flat was considered too close to the posture of the dead. You did not want to confuse God by appearing corpse-like during your nightly rest, and you certainly did not want to attract the attention of the angel of death by sleeping in the same position used at funerals. This concern was superstitious by modern standards, but when your local priest doubled as the community's medical consultant and spiritual advisor, you picked your battles carefully. As a result, many medieval people slept partially reclined, supported by large bolsters, pillows, or the wooden equivalent of a medieval recliner. Nobles sometimes had their beds rigged with angled supports designed to maintain a semi-seated posture throughout the night, perfect for digesting one's evening meal of heavily spiced meat pie, or for fending off surprise demon attacks without the delay of sitting up first. Monks took this practice to its extreme. In stricter monastic orders, they might sleep sitting upright on benches or leaning against cold stone walls, with nothing but their hoods to muffle the discomfort. This was not about health, it was about discipline, about denying the body the comfort it craved. If you were too comfortable, you might dream. If you dreamed, you might sin. If you sinned, welcome to confession at 5 a.m., followed by appropriate penance. This upright sleeping was not about quality rest. It was about virtue demonstrated through discomfort, about theology expressed through posture, about mildly confusing medical and spiritual ideas translated into the practical realm of how you arranged your body at night. It produced sleep that was probably shallow and certainly uncomfortable, but it satisfied the requirements of those who believed that comfort was suspect and that the body should never be permitted to forget its subordinate relationship to the soul. Forget haunted dreams or goblins lurking under the bed. For medieval people, the real monsters of the night were already in the sheets, small, persistent, and entirely uninterested in your prayers, your social status, or your desperate attempts to ignore them. We are speaking, of course, about fleas, lice, and the medieval bedroom's unofficial mascot, the bed bug. These tiny creatures were not occasional visitors but permanent residents of virtually every sleeping space, regardless of social class or cleaning efforts. Let us not sugarcoat the situation. Hygiene was not medieval Europe's strongest suit. Baths were rare events, sometimes occurring only a few times per year. Laundry was expensive and labor-intensive, requiring access to water, soap, and sufficient fuel for heating. The soap itself was sometimes made from substances better left unnamed, using fats and ashes that might not meet modern standards of cosmetic acceptability. Add to this foundation the widespread use of straw mattresses, which provided excellent harborage for insects. Add shared bedding, which allowed vermin to travel easily between sleepers. Add the occasional live chicken roosting nearby, contributing its own parasites to the mix. The result was the perfect environment for an all-you-can-eat pest buffet, with human blood as the primary offering. Fleas and lice were so common that they were practically considered roommates rather than infestations. Peasants dealt with them daily as a matter of course, scratching and twitching through both waking and sleeping hours. Nobles, despite their satin sheets and feather beds, were not exempt from this universal experience. In fact, some wealthier households employed dedicated nitpickers, actual servants whose job consisted of removing lice from their employer's hair and clothing. Imagine that as your occupation, master of the royal scalp, keeper of the noble lice. Bed bugs were the silent assassins of medieval sleep. They hid in wooden bed frames, in mattress seams, in the cracks of stone walls, emerging at night to feed like tiny vampires on the warm blood of sleeping humans. If you have ever wondered why medieval people wore nightcaps and slept fully clothed, it was not always about warmth. Sometimes it was about creating a barrier, a kind of pest defense armor that might, if you were lucky, prevent the worst of the biting. Solutions to the pest problem ranged from mildly effective to impressively deranged. Some households burned strong-smelling herbs like wormwood or tansy, hoping the smoke would repel insects. Others slept with garlic, onions, or even ashes sprinkled in the bed, practices that may have done little for the pests but certainly kept romance to a minimum. If you were considering intimate relations during the watch period, the smell of garlic and ashes might serve as a significant deterrent. The pests were not merely physical discomforts, they carried symbolic weight as well. Fleas were often seen as symbols of sin or moral impurity, biting reminders of the fall of man and the consequences of poor bedding choices. Entire poems were written about fleas, ranging from moralizing warnings to weirdly romantic verses. Because nothing says, "I love you," quite like, "Let us be united like the flea that bites us both," an actual sentiment expressed in medieval poetry. So while modern sleep is interrupted by buzzing phones and the glow of streetlights through windows, medieval sleep was more likely disturbed by scratching, twitching, and the subtle but unmistakable feeling that something was crawling on your shin. Because it was. Something was always crawling on your shin, and there was very little you could do about it except try to sleep anyway. We have all experienced restless nights, tossing and turning while seeking comfort that refuses to arrive. But have you ever tried falling asleep while wearing 100 pounds of iron? No? Well, in the Middle Ages, some people did exactly that, because apparently nothing says "sweet dreams" quite like being prepared to joust at a moment's notice. To be clear, most people, even most knights, did not regularly sleep in full armor. The practice was impractical for daily life. Armor was hot, heavy, and spectacularly loud. Trying to roll over in a suit of chain mail is rather like trying to nap inside a bag of cutlery while someone occasionally shakes the bag. Every movement produces noise, and every noise announces your position to anyone within hearing distance. However, during wartime or in hostile territory, sleeping partially armored was considered the safer choice. Comfort became optional, survival became highly recommended. A knight on campaign might remove only his helmet and gauntlets before attempting to rest, keeping his mail shirt or breastplate on just in case enemies decided to stage a midnight surprise party. There is nothing quite like waking to the sound of hooves and having to suit up while still half dreaming about turnips and the day's other concerns. In castles under siege, men-at-arms might sleep with swords or axes at their sides, treating their weapons like very aggressive security blankets. Shields could serve as improvised pillows, providing a hard surface that was at least familiar. If the enemy breached the walls, at least you would not have to waste precious seconds getting dressed before defending your life. Sleeping in armor was not exactly restorative. Iron does not breathe, and chain mail has a tendency to pinch skin in sensitive places. Add cold stone floors, minimal bedding, and the ambient sounds of snoring comrades mixed with crackling torches, and you have a sleep environment that ranks somewhere below the average modern airport terminal on the comfort scale. Even those not actively engaged in battle sometimes wore light protective gear while sleeping in dangerous regions. Traveling merchants or guards on watch duty might nap in gambesons, thick quilted jackets that offered a reasonable amount of protection and significantly more padding than the moral support of prayer alone. These garments allowed for something approaching comfort while still providing defense against sudden attack. Armor was not subtle. If you rolled over the wrong way, you might clank so loudly that everyone else in the vicinity woke up and assumed the apocalypse had arrived ahead of schedule. The sound of armored sleepers shifting position could be mistaken for an advancing army, causing considerable confusion in the dark hours before dawn. Nevertheless, the practice persisted because the alternative, being caught unarmored and unprepared, was worse than any amount of discomfort. Better to sleep badly in iron than to die naked in bed. In a time when nightly demon attacks, persistent lice infestations, and pigs in your bed were not considered particularly unusual, you might think that sleepwalking would be just one more medieval inconvenience to be tolerated. But no, it was far more dramatic than that. In the Middle Ages, if you started wandering around in your sleep, people did not attribute it to stress, exhaustion, or the lingering effects of a heavy dinner. They assumed you were possessed, bewitched, or had some urgent unfinished business with supernatural forces that required nocturnal negotiation. Sleepwalking, or noctambulation, if you wanted to impress the local monk with your Latin, was poorly understood and widely feared. The idea that someone could rise from their straw pallet, shuffle across the room with eyes open but unseeing, and stare blankly at a wall was not interpreted as a harmless parasomnia. It was interpreted as the devil's rehearsal dinner, a preview of demonic possession that might culminate in something far worse. Historical accounts suggest that people were genuinely terrified by sleepwalkers. Imagine the scene: a man in a long night shirt, holding a candle with unseeing eyes, mumbling Latin that he did not actually speak while consciously awake, stepping over livestock and furniture as if guided by some unseen force. To medieval witnesses, this was not neurological, it was supernatural. You would assume ghost or heretic or both, and depending on your local priest's theological leanings, an exorcism might be scheduled before breakfast. Some medical theorists attributed sleepwalking to imbalanced humors, particularly excess black bile, which served as the medieval catch-all explanation for anything physicians could not otherwise explain. Others thought it occurred because the soul was temporarily released from the body during sleep, leaving the flesh free to wander about like an unattended mule while the spirit was otherwise occupied. To prevent these nocturnal adventures, people tried various remedies. Herbal treatments might be administered. Prayers might be said over the bed. Iron charms might be hung nearby, since iron was believed to ward off supernatural influences. In more rural areas, families might simply tie the sleepwalker's leg to a chair before bed, ensuring that any wandering would be limited by physical restraint. If that sounds extreme, consider that medieval homes contained numerous hazards for the unwary wanderer. Open hearths with live coals. Knives and tools stored within easy reach. Chamber pots waiting to be tragically overturned. A sleepwalker could injure themselves fatally without any supernatural assistance whatsoever. There were rumors of people climbing onto rooftops in their sleep, though whether these accounts were exaggerated or accurate remains unclear. The fear of leaping dreamers led to barred windows and occasional theological debates about whether a person could sin while unconscious, a question that occupied medieval scholars for many hours of presumably conscious deliberation. Most sleepwalkers simply paced, muttered, or attempted to open imaginary doors. But if someone sleepwalked into a church, locals might treat it as a divine sign or call for a cleansing ritual just to cover all spiritual bases. Better safe than damned, after all. If medieval life taught people anything, it was how to sleep through chaos. Church bells, thunderstorms, screaming livestock, the occasional siege. For the sleep-deprived denizens of the Middle Ages, these were merely ambient noises, the medieval equivalent of white noise machines. Let us start with the bells. Church bells marked every sacred moment of the day: sunrise, prayer times, meals, and of course, the ungodly hour of matins at 2 o'clock or 3 a.m. If you lived anywhere near a monastery or parish church, your dreams were probably accompanied by regular tolling, sometimes every few hours throughout the night. At some point, the brain simply accepted this auditory intrusion. Bells became the lullaby of an overscheduled soul, as familiar and ignorable as the sound of your own breathing. And it was not just bells. Storms were frequent and genuinely terrifying in an age before weather prediction and lightning rods. With no weather apps to warn you, no triple-glazed windows to buffer the sound, you experienced every clap of thunder as if the world might actually be ending. Roofs leaked. Windows rattled. Chimneys howled like banshees as wind forced its way through narrow passages. Still, people slept. They had to sleep. Work did not stop for insomnia, and neither did the demands of daily survival. Plowing still needed doing regardless of how poorly you had rested. Prayers still needed saying. Running from Vikings, if you were unfortunate enough to live in a raided area, required energy that only sleep could provide. Speaking of invasions and apocalyptic events, these were not always deal-breakers for bedtime either. In the 14th century, people continued to sleep somehow through famine, war, and even the Black Death, which killed between 1/3 and 1/2 of Europe's population. When death carts rolled by in the morning, collecting bodies for mass graves, it was considered more of a grim wake-up call than a cause for panic-induced insomnia. And if you did not wake up, well, some believed that was a mercy, a peaceful end compared to the agonies of plague. There are even historical records of people sleeping through earthquakes, barn fires, and angry mobs. Sleep deprivation was common, and bodies adjusted to circumstances. If you worked from sunrise to sunset, ate barely enough to survive, and spent your days dodging mud, taxes, and spiritual damnation, you were going to fall asleep hard regardless of external circumstances. The body demanded rest, and it would take it when and where it could. Some people used sleep as a kind of escape hatch from unbearable circumstances. Faced with illness, grief, or fear of the world literally ending, which was forecast with alarming regularity, roughly once per century, some individuals simply curled up under a cloak, mumbled a prayer, and took a nap. There is a strange kind of wisdom in that response, an acknowledgement that some problems cannot be solved by staying awake, and that rest might be the only available comfort in a world that offered few others. In the winter of 1692, the village of Salem, Massachusetts, was cloaked in more than just snow. It was wrapped in tension, suspicion, and a quiet kind of fear that seeped into timber-framed homes and frozen fields, coloring every interaction and poisoning every relationship. The people of Salem were Puritans, strict, devout, and deeply superstitious. They believed themselves to be building a holy community in the American wilderness, a city on a hill watched by God and stalked by Satan. Life was already hard. The village had recently split from Salem town over political and religious disagreements. Crops had failed. Smallpox had ravaged nearby communities, leaving death and grief in its wake. Wars with Native American tribes had left many traumatized, their sense of security permanently shattered. There was friction between neighbors, inheritance disputes simmering beneath the surface, and deep resentment toward outsiders or anyone who did not quite fit the Puritan mold. Add to this the long, dark, bitter New England winter, when darkness fell early and lifted late, when the cold pressed against windows and doors, when isolation became inescapable, and something was bound to break. That break came in the home of Reverend Samuel Parris, the village's minister. His 9-year-old daughter, Betty, and 11-year-old niece, Abigail Williams, began to behave strangely. They screamed uncontrollably for no apparent reason. They threw things across rooms. They contorted their bodies into unnatural positions that seemed impossible for normal joints. At times they fell silent for hours, eyes wide with terror, unresponsive to questions or comfort. Neighbors whispered that the girls were cursed. The girls themselves claimed they were being pinched and bitten by invisible forces, that spectral figures visited them in the night, that they saw things no one else could see. Reverend Parris, uncertain what to do, called in a local doctor named William Griggs. After examining the girls and failing to find any physical cause for their afflictions, Griggs delivered the diagnosis that would plunge the village into chaos: witchcraft. That single word set fire to every fear already simmering in Salem. In a community where witches were believed to be real, actual servants of the devil who had made pacts with evil and received supernatural powers in return, the idea was not far-fetched. It was terrifyingly plausible. And now, if the devil could worm his way into the minister's own household, corrupting children under the very roof of God's representative, what did that mean for everyone else? The girls, prodded by both adults and peers, began naming names. First they accused women on the margins of society, social misfits, outcasts, those who did not fit comfortably into the community's expectations. Sarah Good, a homeless beggar known for muttering when turned away from doorsteps. Sarah Osborne, who had scandalized the village by marrying her indentured servant. Tituba, the enslaved woman in Reverend Parris's household, whose origins in Barbados and knowledge of folk traditions frightened the villagers. But soon the accusations would reach beyond these obvious targets. They would touch the respectable, the wealthy, even the pious. Salem was a small village, but what was about to happen would echo far beyond its borders, creating a legacy of paranoia that still haunts America's historical memory. What began as whispers in the dark would soon become cries from the gallows, and a cautionary tale about what happens when fear replaces reason, when accusation substitutes for evidence, when a community turns on itself in the name of righteousness. Once the idea of witchcraft took root in Salem, it spread like ivy, quiet at first, then strangling everything it touched. The afflicted girls, Betty Parris, Abigail Williams, and soon others like Ann Putnam Jr. and Mercy Lewis, seemed to grow bolder with each passing day. They convulsed in courtrooms, screamed during prayers, and claimed they could see dark spirits hovering over specific villagers. It was not just childhood imagination. It was theatrical, public, and most disturbingly, believed. Adults watched these performances and saw proof of supernatural interference. The more dramatic the fits, the more convincing they seemed. The girls learned that their afflictions brought attention, power, and the satisfaction of seeing adults take them seriously. The first to be accused were those with the least protection, women who already lived on society's edges. Sarah Good was a homeless beggar, known for muttering to herself when turned away from doorsteps. People claimed her mumbling was cursing, that her words carried supernatural weight. She smoked a pipe, which was unseemly for a woman. She snapped at children who tormented her. She fit the mold of a witch because she did not fit the mold of a proper Puritan woman. Sarah Osborne had not attended church in over a year and had scandalized the community by marrying her indentured servant after her first husband died. A woman who defied convention, who made her own choices regardless of social expectations, clearly suspect, clearly in league with forces that encouraged such defiance. Tituba was the most exotic of all. Originating from Barbados, her storytelling, her accent, her unfamiliar folk practices frightened the villagers who did not understand them. Under pressure, possibly even physical beatings from her master, Reverend Parris, Tituba confessed to witchcraft. But instead of clearing the air, her confession blew it wide open. She told a story that fascinated and horrified her listeners. A tall man in black, a figure associated with the devil himself, had asked her to sign a book. She described strange animals, yellow birds, red cats, spectral dogs. But most damaging of all, she claimed there were other witches in Salem, other people who had made pacts with the devil and now worked their evil on the community. That was all the court needed to hear. Once Tituba opened the door to accusations, others rushed through it. New names were added weekly. Neighbors turned on neighbors with terrifying speed. Old grudges, long suppressed, were disguised as righteous accusations. Property disputes became evidence of spectral assault. If someone's cow died suddenly, it must have been witchcraft. If a baby cried during prayer, surely that was the devil's doing through some witch's influence. The fear became so infectious that even the innocent dared not speak out. To defend an accused which was to invite suspicion upon yourself. Silence was safety, or at least, silence seemed safer than speech. And so the web of accusations widened, trapping the village in its sticky, unseen threads. Logic was fading. Hysteria was now in control. And no one knew where it would stop, or who would be next. As accusations mounted and the village reached a fever pitch of fear, the colonial government stepped in. Governor William Phips, recently appointed and eager to maintain order in his jurisdiction, established a special court to deal with the chaos threatening to consume Salem. It was called the Court of Oyer and Terminer, from the French, meaning, to hear and determine. But what it really became was a factory for fear-driven justice, a machine designed to process accusations rather than to discover truth. The court convened in Salem town in June of 1692, and it was no ordinary tribunal. Its rules were warped by panic, shaped by the assumption that witchcraft was real and that the only question was identifying which community members were guilty. Instead of requiring hard evidence or reliable witnesses, the court allowed something far more dangerous: spectral evidence. Spectral evidence was testimony that a spirit or specter of the accused had afflicted the victim. In other words, if a person claimed to have seen your ghost-like form in a dream, choking them or pinching them or tempting them to sin, that testimony was admissible in court. Never mind that the accused could be asleep in their own bed, or miles away, or surrounded by witnesses who could attest to their physical presence. It was their spirit, their specter, that had done the devil's work. You could not cross-examine a dream. You could not disprove a vision. And worse, the more you protested your innocence, the more the afflicted girls convulsed and screamed, providing what the court considered evidence of your guilt. Your denials became proof of your deception. Your confusion became proof of your cunning. Children were now treated as star witnesses. Their seizures, screams, and gasps in court became more theatrical by the day. One girl, Mary Walcott, would fall into fits the moment a suspected witch entered the room. If a prisoner looked at her, she shrieked. If they did not look at her, she shrieked louder. The performances were mesmerizing, and the judges accepted it all as genuine affliction. The judges included influential figures like Judge Samuel Sewell and Chief Justice William Stoughton, men who should have known better but who were caught up in the same hysteria as everyone else. They believed they were doing God's work, rooting out Satan's servants from their community. They did not see that they were becoming executioners in the name of fear. Defense lawyers did not exist in colonial trials. If you were accused, you stood alone, without counsel, without anyone to speak for you. If you denied the charges, the afflicted girls writhed in agony, providing the court with all the evidence it needed. If you confessed, you might be spared death. But only if you named others, providing new targets for the court's attention. The system rewarded lies and punished silence. It turned neighbor against neighbor, child against parent, congregation against minister. And still the accusations continued, because the only way to be safe was to accuse someone else, to redirect suspicion before it landed on you. Worse still, the trials became public spectacles. People traveled from nearby towns to witness the proceedings, to watch the girls convulse and the accused protest their innocence. The accused were paraded into court in shackles, often bewildered, often poor, and almost always powerless against the machinery of accusation. And yet, not everyone believed. Some townsfolk whispered that the girls were faking, that their convulsions were rather than affliction. Others questioned why only certain types of people were being accused: the poor, the outcast, the defiant, the different. But few spoke openly, because speaking openly meant risking accusation. Questioning the court meant questioning the will of God, or so the judges claimed. In Salem, reason had stepped aside, and the law had become a mirror reflecting fear rather than justice. The mirror showed only monsters, and the monsters it showed were the neighbors, friends, and family members of those who looked into it. On June 10, 1692, the gallows in Salem claimed their first victim. Bridget Bishop was not new to scandal. Her reputation had made her an easy target long before the trials began. She wore bright red clothing, which Puritans considered immodest and attention-seeking. She ran a tavern where people drank and sometimes behaved improperly. And she had been accused of witchcraft years earlier, though that accusation had gone nowhere. During her trial, neighbors testified against her with enthusiasm. They claimed her spirit had pinched them in the night, leaving bruises that proved her malice. They said their babies had died after she passed by their homes. They claimed she kept enchanted dolls, puppets, that she used to work her evil magic. Bridget denied everything. She maintained her innocence to the end. But the court found her guilty based on the spectral evidence, based on the girl's convulsions, based on the accumulated suspicion of a lifetime of not fitting in. She was led to Gallows Hill, a barren, windswept patch of earth just outside Salem. No prayer was offered for her soul, or if it was a prayer for damnation rather than mercy. The rope was pulled. The crowd watched. And with that single execution, the machinery of death began to churn in earnest. The hangings that followed came quickly, as if the court was eager to prove its effectiveness. On July 19, 5 more women were executed: Sarah Good, Susanna Martin, Rebecca Nurse, Elizabeth Howe, and Sarah Wilds. Some had enjoyed good standing in the community before the accusations began. Rebecca Nurse, in particular, was a shocking case, an elderly, pious woman beloved by many, respected for her devotion and her gentle character. Even the jury initially found Rebecca not guilty. The evidence against her seemed flimsy even by the distorted standards of the court. But when the verdict was announced, the afflicted girls began to scream and convulse with renewed fury. The judges, visibly disturbed by this reaction, sent the jury back to reconsider. Under pressure from the court and the continuing performance of the girls, the verdict was reversed. Rebecca Nurse was condemned to die. Her final words were whispered through the air like a warning, like a prophecy: "I am as innocent as the child unborn." But it did not matter. The noose did not discriminate between guilt and innocence. It only required a body to hang. In August, more executions followed. On September 22, the deadliest day, 8 people were hanged in a single morning. Among them was Martha Corey, a woman who had doubted the trials early on, who had expressed skepticism about the girls' performances. Her doubt became her death sentence. Her husband, Giles Corey, met a different fate. When he was accused, he refused to enter a plea, guilty or not guilty, knowing that if he pled not guilty, he would be tried and almost certainly hanged, and if he pled guilty, his property would be confiscated by the state, leaving his children with nothing. The court, unable to proceed with a trial without a plea, resorted to an ancient English punishment called peine forte et dure, pressing. Giles Corey was laid on the ground, and heavy stones were placed on his chest, slowly, cruelly, over the course of 3 days. As the weight increased, as his breathing grew more difficult, as death approached, he was asked repeatedly to enter a plea. His final words, as legend has it, were, "More weight." By the end of the hysteria, 19 people had been hanged, 1 had been pressed to death, and at least 5 more had died in jail while awaiting trial. Dozens confessed falsely to save their lives, signing statements that admitted guilt in exchange for survival. Over 200 people were accused in total. The gallows cast long shadows over Salem, not just on the hill where the executions took place, but in every heart. Fear had become law, and justice, blindfolded, had been led to the scaffold. While the executions claimed the spotlight and the attention of history, hundreds of others sat in cramped, foul-smelling jails, waiting for verdicts or miracles that might never come. Salem's small jail could not contain them all. Accused witches were held in neighboring towns like Ipswich and Boston, chained to walls, starving, freezing, and forgotten by the community that had once known them. Most of the accused were not witches or even social outcasts. They were neighbors, friends, parents, children, people whose only crime was having quarreled with the wrong person, or owning land someone else wanted, or simply being different enough to attract suspicion. In many cases, personal grudges disguised as divine justice drove the accusations. A pig wandered into a neighbor's yard and died. Must be witchcraft. Someone refused to help with firewood. Clearly they had cursed the axe. Mary Easty, sister of the executed Rebecca Nurse, was one such case. She was a respected mother of 7, known throughout the community for her piety and good character. Initially released by the court when evidence against her seemed insufficient, she was rearrested days later after new fits afflicted the accusing girls. Her second arrest sealed her fate. In a final petition to the judges, Mary begged them not for her own life, but that they put a stop to the proceedings before more innocent blood was shed. She wrote with clarity and dignity, maintaining her innocence while acknowledging that her words would not save her. She was hanged soon after. Another notable case was Dorothy Good, the 4-year-old daughter of Sarah Good. After her mother's arrest, little Dorothy was interrogated by magistrates who expected answers from her. Under pressure, confused and terrified, the child confessed to being a witch. Her answers, gibberish, fear, the desperate attempts of a young child to please adults, were taken as truth. Dorothy was imprisoned for 8 months in chains. When finally released, she was mentally broken, never recovering from the trauma of those months in darkness, separated from her mother, surrounded by strangers who treated her as a criminal. She was 4 years old. Pregnant women were not spared. Elizabeth Proctor, whose husband John Proctor would later hang, was found guilty and sentenced to die. But because she was pregnant, her execution was delayed until after she gave birth. That delay likely saved her life. By the time her child was born, the hysteria had begun to recede. She gave birth in jail and was eventually released after the trials ended. Accusations snowballed through the community. Some accused confessed in desperation to avoid death, then named others to shift suspicion away from themselves. Entire families were pulled into the spiral: fathers, wives, daughters, sons. No one was beyond reach, no reputation sturdy enough to guarantee safety. Meanwhile, the jails swelled beyond capacity. Food was scarce, contaminated, insufficient. Disease spread through the confined populations. Some died awaiting trial, lost in the legal limbo of paranoia, their cases never resolved because death resolved them first. And still new names were added each week, new arrests made, new families torn apart. In Salem, it no longer mattered who you were, only who was willing to say your name in accusation. By the fall of 1692, the spell of hysteria began to crack. Not because the court came to its senses through wisdom or compassion, but because reality forced its way back in through the sheer absurdity of what was happening. The turning point came when accusations grew too bold, reaching people who had previously supported the trials. Those who had once cheered the convictions found themselves suddenly on the wrong side of the accusations, their own names whispered in the same breath that had condemned their neighbors. Reverend George Burroughs, a former Salem minister, was arrested and charged with being the ringleader of the witches. He was well-educated, well-spoken, and had previously clashed with influential families in the village. That was enough for accusation, enough for trial, enough for condemnation. But on the day of his execution, Burroughs did something shocking. Standing on the gallows, with the noose around his neck and the crowd watching in expectant silence, he flawlessly recited the Lord's Prayer from beginning to end. This was significant because witches were believed incapable of praying. The devil's power supposedly prevented them from speaking holy words correctly. The crowd fell silent. Some wept. Even hardened observers, even those who had called for his death, were shaken by the sight of a condemned man praying perfectly before his execution. But the execution went on. Burroughs was hanged despite the evidence of his innocence. That moment planted a seed of doubt in many minds. If a witch could recite the Lord's Prayer, what else might the court have wrong? Then came the accusation of Mary Phipps, the wife of Governor William Phipps himself. Suddenly, the hysteria had reached the very top of the colony's social ladder. If the governor's wife could be accused, no one was safe, and that realization changed everything. Governor Phipps, already unnerved by growing criticism of the trials and the chaos they had created, finally took action. In October 1692, he dissolved the court of Oyer and Terminer, halting all pending executions and trials. The machinery of death stopped, abruptly and completely. Public sentiment had shifted. Ministers who had once been silent or complicit began to speak out against the proceedings. Increase Mather, one of the colony's most respected theologians, denounced the use of spectral evidence in no uncertain terms. "It were better," he wrote, "that 10 suspected witches should escape than that one innocent person should be condemned." This was a radical thought in a society that had for months believed exactly the opposite, that it was better to condemn many than to risk letting one witch go free. People who had once cheered the trials began to question them. The jails were still full, but the appetite for more blood had dulled. Too many respected figures had been accused. Too many innocent people had been buried in unmarked graves. The villagers had begun to see that this was not divine justice at work, it was madness, pure and simple. Confessions dried up. Some accusers backtracked, admitting that they had been mistaken or pressured into naming names. Others simply disappeared from public view, unwilling to face the consequences of their testimony. Those who had previously shouted the loudest now lowered their eyes and hoped to be forgotten. The fear had not disappeared, but it had exhausted itself. The public wanted stability. The officials wanted to save face. And Salem, bruised and ashamed, was finally ready to wake from its nightmare. The storm was breaking. But the damage had already been done. By late 1692, the judicial system that had fueled the hysteria began to collapse under the weight of its own absurdity. With the court of Oyer and Terminer disbanded in October, new, more cautious court, the Superior Court of Judicature, was formed in early 1693. This time, things were different. Spectral evidence was no longer allowed. The judges, having learned from the disasters of the previous year, were noticeably more skeptical of the accusers' wild claims. The result was dramatic: convictions slowed to a trickle. Many accused witches were acquitted outright. Of the 56 cases brought before the new court, the majority resulted in release. Even those who had already confessed began to recant their testimonies, admitting that fear, torture, or pressure had forced them to lie. The dramatic performances of the afflicted girls, once so convincing, lost their persuasive power when subjected to actual scrutiny. Without spectral evidence to support them, the accusations fell apart. The most prominent case in the unraveling was that of Reverend Samuel Willard, a respected minister who came under suspicion. While he was never formally charged, the fact that such a high-ranking, devout man could be suspected highlighted how arbitrary and corrupt the process had become. If a minister could be accused, the entire foundation of the trials crumbled. The court, once ferocious in its pursuit of convictions, was now cautious. They began quietly releasing those still in jail, first those with little evidence against them, then eventually even those who had confessed to witchcraft under duress. The jails emptied, but the damage to lives and families could not be undone. Families of the executed began to demand justice. John Proctor's children petitioned for the return of his property, confiscated after his execution. Rebecca Nurse's family launched a campaign to clear her name, gathering testimony and petitioning the government for official recognition of her innocence. In time, community shame replaced community fear. Church congregations fractured under the weight of what had happened. Friendships that had survived for decades were severed by accusations and betrayals. The very fabric of Salem's social order had been shredded, and no court decision could restore what had been lost. Governor Phipps, recognizing the colony's growing international embarrassment and the depth of local anger, pardoned the remaining prisoners in 1693. But even freedom came at a cost. Many families had to pay for their own jail fees before being released, room and board charges for the months they had spent imprisoned. Imagine losing your home, your health, your reputation, and nearly your life, only to be handed a bill for the privilege of surviving. By the end of the ordeal, 19 people had been hanged, 1 had been pressed to death, and 5 had died in jail awaiting trial. Over 200 had been accused. The court did not just collapse, it imploded, leaving behind a crater of guilt, grief, and disbelief. The trials had ended, but the healing had not even begun. Salem was a village forever altered by the people it had lost, the justice it had abandoned, and the mirror it was now forced to look into. The gallows were silent now. The jails had emptied. But Salem was far from peaceful. The town was not haunted by ghosts, it was haunted by guilt. What had started with a handful of sick girls had exploded into a communal act of destruction. Families had been torn apart. Reputations, built over lifetimes, had been ruined in days. Innocent lives had been ended by the very people who should have protected them. And now the survivors had to live in the wreckage. Neighbors could no longer look each other in the eye. The same people who had once prayed together had testified against one another, had watched each other's executions, had done nothing to stop the killing. Trust, once broken, could not be restored by any proclamation or pardon. Some of the afflicted girls quietly left town, unable to face the community they had helped destroy. Others faded from public view, living out their lives in obscurity and, presumably, shame. A few, like Ann Putnam Jr., would later express remorse. In 1706, she stood before her congregation and publicly apologized for her role in the trials, blaming delusion by Satan for her actions. But for many victims' families, the damage was beyond words, beyond apology. The court officials, too, carried their burden. Judge Samuel Sewall, one of the most prominent figures in the trials, was one of the few to admit wrongdoing publicly. In a remarkable act of penance, he stood during a church service in 1697 while a minister read out his confession and prayer for forgiveness. It was a rare moment of accountability in a time when most tried to forget, to move on, to pretend the nightmare had never happened. But forgetting was not easy. The families of the condemned continued to demand compensation, to seek official recognition that their loved ones had been innocent. Over the years, petitions flooded the Massachusetts government, asking for pardons, for returned property, for public acknowledgement of wrongdoing. Slowly, the government responded. In 1711, the colony passed a bill restoring the rights and good names of some victims and offering limited financial restitution to their heirs. But even that was not comprehensive. Some families, like the Coreys and the Proctors, were left out entirely, their claims unresolved. Whispers of witchcraft never quite left New England, but in Salem, the shame became part of the town's identity. The village eventually changed its name to Danvers, perhaps hoping to distance itself from its infamous past. Gallows Hill was never officially marked, as if the town hoped to bury not just the dead but the memory of what had happened there. But the memory persisted, in sermons, in stories, in the silence between former friends who could not forget what they had done or failed to do. Salem had not been cursed by witches. It had been cursed by fear, by pride, by unchecked power, and by the willingness of ordinary people to believe the worst about their neighbors. That curse would linger long after the executions stopped. The Salem witch trials ended more than 3 centuries ago, but their legacy continues to echo, not just in textbooks and historical tours, but in how we understand justice, fear, and the fragility of truth. What happened in 1692 was not simply a strange episode of mass hysteria, a peculiar aberration in an otherwise rational history. It was a breakdown of logic, compassion, and legal integrity in the face of panic. Ordinary people, farmers, midwives, ministers, mothers, became executioners simply by believing too easily and questioning too little. They did not need to be monsters to commit monstrous acts. They only needed to be afraid enough, and certain enough, to abandon the principles that normally restrained them. The courts meant to protect the innocent became tools of oppression. Religion, which should have counseled mercy and humility, was weaponized to justify killing. Testimony became theater, with the most dramatic performances treated as the most convincing evidence. Silence became guilt, and doubt became dangerous. One of the most chilling aspects of Salem's tragedy is how quickly it unfolded. In a matter of months, fear overcame fact. Old grudges, dressed up as spiritual warfare, became death sentences. It did not take demons or devils to create this horror. It only took belief in them, and the willingness to act on that belief without evidence, without mercy, without restraint. But the trials also taught hard-earned lessons that would ripple through American society. In the years and centuries that followed, the Salem episode would be cited repeatedly in debates about due process and civil liberties. The United States Constitution, written nearly a century later, would explicitly prohibit things like ex post facto laws and bills of attainder, measures that had, in effect, doomed the accused in Salem. The guarantee of a right to legal counsel, the right to face your accusers, the requirement for concrete evidence rather than spectral testimony, these were hard-won principles forged in part from the ashes of Gallows Hill. The Constitution's protections against unreasonable searches and seizures, its insistence on fair trials, its assumption of innocence until proven guilty, all reflect lessons learned from Salem and similar tragedies. In modern times, the phrase, witch hunt, has become shorthand for political persecution or moral panic, though it is often used with little regard for the real terror those words represent. In truth, Salem was not a metaphor. It was a town where people were hanged for imaginary crimes, betrayed by the very systems designed to protect them. Perhaps the most lasting lesson is this: fear unchecked can become its own form of tyranny. And when fear is legitimized by power, by courts, by churches, by governments, by popular opinion, it becomes almost unstoppable. The only defense against it is vigilance, skepticism, and the courage to speak even when speaking is dangerous. The Salem witch trials are a cautionary tale, not just of one village's descent into madness, but of how easily reason can fall when fear is given authority. The gallows may be gone, the courtrooms quiet, but the warning still stands. Truth is fragile. Justice is not automatic. And history has a habit of repeating itself unless we remember. In the long history of Rome, few women left marks as deep, or as controversial, as Fulvia. Born around 83 BCE into the elite Fulvii family, she entered a world where women were expected to be seen rarely and heard never. The Fulvii were an old plebeian house that had long since clawed its way into the upper echelons of Roman politics, producing consuls, generals, and orators over generations. Their bloodline carried both ambition and a taste for disruption, qualities that would find their fullest expression in Fulvia herself. Her father, Marcus Fulvius Bambalio, was known more for his bumbling speech than any political achievement. His nickname, Bambalio, literally referred to his stammer, his difficulty in speaking with the fluency expected of a Roman aristocrat. But Fulvia inherited none of her father's verbal hesitation. She was born to command, to speak, to act. From a young age, Fulvia would have been surrounded by the sharp-edged world of Roman power. Senators and generals debated policy in her home. Elections and treachery were daily news, discussed openly among adults who took for granted that politics was a blood sport. She would have seen how politics was not just played in the forum, but in marriages, funerals, rumors, and backroom deals where the fate of the republic was decided. Women in elite Roman households were expected to be quiet partners, refined, educated, graceful, and obedient. They managed households, raised children, and influenced their husbands through private counsel rather than public action. Fulvia would break all of these expectations systematically and spectacularly. She was wealthy, highly educated, and connected to the most powerful families in Rome. And she knew it. While her early life remains hazy in historical records, her later actions suggest a young woman who was observant, politically literate, and utterly unafraid of the consequences of stepping outside traditional boundaries. This was not someone who faded into the background, not someone content with the shadows. She had a strong personality, a sharp political mind, and a will to act even in the male-dominated space of Roman governance. In an era when women who appeared in historical records usually did so because of their relationships to men, as daughters, wives, mothers, Fulvia would appear because of what she herself did. This was also a period of unprecedented instability in Rome. The Republic was unraveling, torn apart by civil wars, populist revolts, and power struggles between generals like Sulla, Pompey, and Caesar. The old rules were collapsing, the old certainties dissolving. Fulvia came of age right in the middle of this chaos, and rather than recoiling from it, she learned to use it. Her early life did not produce the kind of modest matron Rome idealized. It produced a woman who saw politics not as a man's world to be feared, but as a battlefield to be mastered. She would go on to marry 3 of the most powerful and controversial men of her era, each marriage a strategic alliance that advanced her position and influence. But Fulvia would not just marry power. She would command armies, lead revolts, and become the first Roman woman to appear on coinage, not as a goddess or mythological figure, but as herself, a living woman with political authority. Rome was not ready for Fulvia. But Fulvia was ready for Rome. Fulvia's first marriage was to Publius Clodius Pulcher, and it was anything but conventional. Clodius was no ordinary Roman noble. He was a populist agitator, a political arsonist with a flair for chaos, scandal, and street-level power that made the traditional aristocracy deeply uncomfortable. To many of the Roman elite, Clodius was dangerous, a man who mocked traditions, disrupted sacred rituals, and courted the urban mob as his power base. To the masses, he was a hero, a champion of their interests against the arrogant nobles who treated them as beneath notice. And to Fulvia, he was a strategic opportunity, a partner whose ambitions matched her own. Their marriage, sometime in the early 50s BCE, united Fulvia with the man who had turned the Roman Republic into his personal stage. Clodius was infamous for his theatrical defiance of tradition. He had once disguised himself as a woman to infiltrate a sacred female-only religious ceremony in Caesar's home, scandalous behavior that somehow only increased his popularity with the masses who appreciated his willingness to flout convention. He later renounced his patrician status, giving up the highest social rank, to run for the tribunate of the plebs, an office that gave him veto power over the Senate and direct access to popular assemblies. Clodius understood Rome's street politics better than most senators understood the law, and he used that understanding to build a power base that traditional politicians could not match. Fulvia, far from being a passive consort, was right there beside him. She was not a silent partner content to manage the household while her husband managed politics. Roman sources suggest she actively participated in Clodius's political world, engaging with his supporters, appearing publicly during his campaigns, and managing their home as a hub for his political operations. Together, they represented a new kind of Roman power couple, bold, populist, and unapologetically aggressive. They did not apologize for breaking rules or challenging traditions. They presented themselves as a different way of doing politics, and many Romans found their approach compelling. But the alliance came at a terrible cost. In 52 BCE, Clodius was murdered on the Appian Way by the bodyguards of his political rival, Titus Annius Milo. His death sent shock waves through Rome, sparking riots and political chaos. But Fulvia was not about to mourn quietly or retreat into private grief. She staged a political funeral that historians still discuss today. She paraded Clodius's mutilated body through the Roman Forum, displaying his wounds, his blood, the evidence of his murder for all to see. The public was horrified and enraged. Riots erupted. The Senate house itself was burned to the ground by mobs responding to Fulvia's display. Fulvia had turned personal grief into public uprising, private loss into political weapon. This was her first major independent political act, and it worked spectacularly. Her ability to manipulate public emotion, to use spectacle as strategy, to wield her husband's legacy as a weapon against his enemies, these skills made her a new kind of player in Roman politics. Clodius was gone, but Fulvia had stepped out of the shadows. Rome would never see her the same way again. Fulvia did not linger in mourning. In Rome, political capital had a short shelf life, and she understood that better than anyone who had not grown up watching the Republic devour its children. Shortly after the violent death of Clodius Pulcher, she entered into a second marriage, this time to Gaius Scribonius Curio, a rising political star and one of Julius Caesar's most passionate supporters. On the surface, Curio seemed an unlikely match for the widow of Rome's most notorious populist. He had a flamboyant reputation and a taste for drama that matched Clodius's, but beneath the bravado was a sharp political operator with genuine talent for navigating Rome's treacherous waters. As tribune of the plebs in 50 BCE, Curio wielded enormous influence during one of Rome's most volatile periods. The Republic teetered between war and peace, between Caesar's ambitions and the Senate's resistance, between the old order and whatever would replace it. Curio's position gave him veto power, and he used it strategically to advance Caesar's interests while maintaining plausible deniability. Fulvia saw in Curio not just a husband but a bridge to the next power block. This was no romantic rebound, it was a calculated alliance, a strategic move designed to keep her connected to the centers of power. With Clodius gone, Fulvia needed a new political anchor. Someone who could carry forward the populist legacy her first husband had built and someone who had Caesar's backing. Curio fit both requirements perfectly. Through him, Fulvia remained tightly embedded in the shifting power dynamics of Rome. She did not just marry into the movement, she helped shape it, using her experience, her connections, and her understanding of street politics to influence Curio's decisions. Fulvia ensured that Clodius's supporters stayed active and loyal, rebranding their cause under Curio's leadership and keeping the urban masses politically engaged. She understood that political power in Rome depended on popular support as much as senatorial approval, and she maintained the networks her first husband had built. But the Roman world was collapsing fast. Tensions between Caesar and Pompey exploded into civil war, dividing the Republic against itself. Curio, committed to Caesar's cause, threw himself into the fight, taking command of military forces in Caesar's name. Fulvia, as always, remained politically involved. She reportedly helped organize support and manage resources for her husband's campaign, using her skills and connections to ensure he had what he needed. This was not the passive support expected of a Roman wife, it was active participation in military politics. In 49 BCE, Curio led a military expedition to Africa to secure Caesar's position against Pompeian forces. It was a disaster. He was ambushed and killed by the forces of King Juba of Numidia, who had allied with Pompey. His death was brutal, his army annihilated, his body never recovered for proper burial. Once again, Fulvia was widowed. Once again, Rome waited to see if she would fade into the background, retreat into private grief, accept the limitations of widowhood. Once again, she did not. Curio's death only solidified her status as a political widow with dangerous resilience. She had now lost 2 husbands to Rome's civil unrest, and both had died fighting for populist causes against the established order. But Fulvia was far from finished. Her most audacious partnership, and her most dramatic chapter, was still to come. Fulvia's third and most famous marriage was to Mark Antony, the ambitious general and loyal ally of Julius Caesar. Their union, forged sometime around 47 BCE, was not merely a romantic attachment, it was a merger of power, a joining of 2 forces that would shake the Roman world. Fulvia had already proven herself as a master of Roman street politics, a woman who could mobilize crowds, manage factions, and wield influence through networks her husbands had built. Antony, rising rapidly through military and political ranks, needed that kind of savvy support in Rome while he was away on campaign. Together they formed one of the most politically potent couples of the late Republic. By the time of their marriage, Fulvia was no stranger to blood and betrayal. She had buried 2 husbands and outmaneuvered countless enemies. She understood that politics in Rome was war by other means, and she had the scars to prove her experience. Antony was no stranger to scandal either. He drank heavily, gambled extravagantly, and his personal life was notoriously chaotic by any standard. But with Fulvia, Antony had found someone who could do more than entertain him. She could defend his interests when he was absent, hold his alliances together when they frayed, and rally supporters when his enemies moved against him. And Antony, despite his brash exterior, understood her value. He allowed Fulvia to exercise authority that no Roman woman had publicly wielded before. She opened his correspondence, reading letters meant for his eyes only and responding when appropriate. She issued orders in his absence, directing his supporters and managing his affairs. She sat in on meetings with important allies and influenced appointments to positions of power. Roman sources, mostly hostile to her, depicted her as overbearing and power-hungry. But what disturbed them most was not her ambition, it was that she acted like a Roman man in a world that had no language for such a woman. After Caesar's assassination in 44 BCE, the Republic was plunged into chaos once more. Antony rushed to secure his position as Caesar's political heir, maneuvering among the various factions competing for power. But it was Fulvia who held Rome itself, maintaining his influence in the capital while he negotiated with rivals. While Antony formed the Second Triumvirate with Octavian and Lepidus, the three-man dictatorship that would rule Rome, Fulvia acted as his representative in the capital. She managed patronage networks, coordinated with the street gangs that still controlled urban politics, and ensured that Antony's supporters remained mobilized and loyal. She even helped arrange Antony's official reconciliation with Octavian by marrying her daughter Clodia to him, an alliance that would later implode spectacularly when Octavian divorced her to make a more advantageous marriage. In public, Fulvia appeared not just as Antony's wife but as his proxy, his representative, his partner in power. Roman coins were minted bearing both Antony's image and Fulvia's name, an unprecedented acknowledgement of her status and authority. She was not hidden in the shadows of power. She stood in its full glare, daring anyone to object. But power in Rome was always borrowed, always temporary, always subject to the whims of men who could not tolerate a woman who acted like them. Fulvia was about to test the limits of how far a woman could go before Rome snapped back. While Mark Antony pursued military campaigns and political deals across the Roman world, it was Fulvia who controlled the streets of Rome. She was not just his wife, she was his regent in all but name, the person who maintained his position and advanced his interests while he was elsewhere. In a period where violence, bribery, and raw influence maintained order more effectively than laws, Fulvia proved she could play the game as well as, if not better than, any man in the Senate. Rome in the aftermath of Caesar's assassination was a battlefield without swords, where power was measured by who you could mobilize, who you could pay, who you could intimidate. Fulvia understood this new landscape and she anchored Antony's authority in the capital by becoming his political substitute. She directed allies, dealt with the urban plebs, negotiated with factions, and most daringly, waged war with words and silver. She financed loyal troops from her own resources, offered bribes to keep public order, and ensured that any legislation passed favored Antony's future interests. Some ancient sources, especially those hostile to her like Appian and Dio Cassius, paint Fulvia as manipulative, shrewish, and even warmongering. But beneath the misogynistic exaggeration lies a woman actively doing politics in a world that had no protocol for a woman doing anything beyond weaving and mourning. The same behaviors that would have made a man a statesman made Fulvia a monster in the eyes of historians who could not accept female agency. Fulvia was building coalitions, backing military commanders, and even issuing what amounted to decrees, functions normally reserved for senators and consuls. She also made public appearances and maintained strong relationships with veteran soldiers, a politically vital demographic in the power struggles of the late Republic. Soldiers remembered who supported them, who paid them, who cared about their interests. While Antony was campaigning in the east, Fulvia was often the face of his authority in Italy, meeting with centurions, influencing decisions about land distribution, and reminding the soldiers that their loyalty to Antony came with rewards. She was not just maintaining his position, she was building it, strengthening it, making it more secure. But this accumulation of power came at a cost. Roman aristocrats, particularly the faction aligned with Octavian, Caesar's young heir and Antony's increasingly bitter rival, resented Fulvia's influence. They viewed her as a meddling woman with too much sway over legions, laws, and loyalties. Her ability to act without male guardianship was not just threatening, it was unprecedented, and precedents matter in a society built on tradition. Fulvia was not naive. She knew the tension between Antony and Octavian was growing, knew that their alliance was cracking under the pressure of competing ambitions. She could see that the Republic was not big enough for both of them, that eventually one would have to eliminate the other. So Fulvia began preparing for the next phase. Not diplomacy, but confrontation. She had stood behind power long enough. Now she was ready to take it into her own hands. In 41 BCE, Fulvia did the unthinkable. She went to war against Octavian, the future Augustus, the man who would become Rome's first emperor. And she did not do it quietly or indirectly. She raised armies, commanded troops, and led a rebellion in her husband's name. With her husband Mark Antony still stationed in the east, preoccupied with his campaigns and his growing entanglement with Cleopatra, Fulvia and Lucius Antonius, Antony's younger brother and a consul, took it upon themselves to challenge Octavian's authority in Italy. The stated cause was to defend Antony's interests and protect the land rights of Roman veterans loyal to him. But underneath it all, Fulvia's fingerprints were everywhere. This was not just politics. This was a military rebellion led by a Roman woman, the first and only time in Roman history that a woman would actively provoke and organize a civil war. The conflict, known as the Perusine War, was triggered by Octavian's controversial land redistribution program, which displaced many Italian farmers to reward his own soldiers. Fulvia seized on the growing discontent, portraying Octavian as a tyrant and traitor to Caesar's legacy. With Lucius acting as her front man in the Senate and Fulvia organizing behind the scenes, they raised 8 legions and seized the city of Perugia, modern-day Perugia. Make no mistake, this was Fulvia's war. Ancient sources suggest she was more invested in the conflict than Lucius himself, more committed to confrontation, more willing to take risks. She rallied troops, stirred public opinion, and even corresponded directly with generals in the field. Rome buzzed with rumors of her commanding legions, issuing orders, and forcing Lucius into confrontations he might have preferred to avoid. Octavian, though surprised by the rebellion, acted quickly. He besieged Perugia through the winter of 41 to 40 BCE, cutting off supplies and hammering the city into submission. Fulvia, trapped inside with dwindling food and growing despair, watched her bold gamble unravel. By early 40 BCE, the city surrendered. Lucius Antonius was spared, likely as a gesture to avoid permanently alienating Antony, but Fulvia was exiled. The woman who had once commanded riots, marriages, armies, and public opinion was now deemed too dangerous for Roman soil. She was sent to Sicyon in Greece, where she hoped to reunite with Antony and explain her actions. But Antony did not come running. The once powerful alliance between husband and wife had eroded in the fog of war and distance. Fulvia had acted in his name, but perhaps without his blessing. She had dared to do what no Roman woman had done before, wage a civil war. And now the Republic had made her pay the price. Banished from Rome, Fulvia arrived in Sicyon, a city in Greece that had become a kind of diplomatic purgatory for failed power players. She had gone to war not for personal gain but in her husband's name, believing she was defending Mark Antony's interests, his honor, and perhaps their shared vision of what Rome should become. But what awaited her in exile was not a hero's welcome or even a sympathetic hearing. It was silence. Fulvia had risked everything, her status, her alliances, her life, for a man who did not come to her defense. By the time she reached Greece, Antony was already deeply entangled with Cleopatra in Egypt. Whether their romantic relationship had fully begun or was merely brewing, the symbolism was crushing. While Fulvia was raising legions, fighting a war, risking everything for his cause, Antony was raising goblets at banquets beside a queen. The betrayal cut deep, not just personally but politically. Fulvia had fought a war to protect Antony's power in Italy, and in response, he let her hang out to dry, accepting her exile as a convenient solution to a political problem. Some ancient historians, especially Plutarch, suggest that Antony was furious with her for launching the Perusine War without his direct approval. Others argue he welcomed her downfall. It cleared the way for a marriage alliance with Octavian, something Fulvia would never have tolerated while she lived. By marrying Octavian's sister Octavia, Antony could cement a new peace with his rival, using Fulvia's death as the bridge. Still, Fulvia was not entirely without supporters. Some of Antony's troops, fiercely loyal to her from her years of managing their interests, urged reconciliation. They remembered that she had fought for them, provided for them, cared about their welfare when Antony was elsewhere. But her health had begun to fail. After enduring siege, exile, and betrayal, Fulvia died in Sicyon in 40 BCE. She was around 43 years old. The cause of death remains uncertain, possibly illness, possibly stress, possibly heartbreak, or all three combined. Ancient sources offer conflicting accounts, as they always do with women who defied easy categorization. Her death provided Antony with a clean political exit. He met with Octavian shortly afterward and agreed to marry Octavia as part of a renewed peace treaty. The triumvirs were temporarily united again, bound by marriage and mutual interest. But they were united only because Fulvia, the one woman bold enough to challenge their designs, the one person who might have prevented their reconciliation, was gone. Fulvia's legacy would soon be overshadowed by Cleopatra, whose myth would consume nearly every Roman woman of the period in its telling and retelling. But make no mistake, Fulvia was the prototype, the original, the woman who showed what was possible before Cleopatra ever met Antony. She did not wield power from behind a curtain, whispering advice into her husband's ear while remaining invisible. She marched into the center of power, stood in its full light, and dared to command armies in a world that treated women as furniture. Rome did not know what to do with her, so it tried to erase her, but the ashes of her rebellion would linger, and her story was far from ordinary. After Fulvia's death in 40 BCE, the men she had once maneuvered, Antony, Octavian, and even her former allies began the quiet work of rewriting her legacy. She could not defend herself from beyond the grave, so the narrative was shaped by her enemies and the uneasy survivors of her ambition. And like so many powerful women in history, Fulvia became a scapegoat. Ancient sources, mostly penned by men with vested interests in the Augustan settlement that followed, painted her as the reason for the Perusine War, the rift between Antony and Octavian, and even the general disorder of the late Republic. Appian, Dio Cassius, and Plutarch depict her as overbearing, jealous, and driven by a lust for power that exceeded proper feminine bounds. They blamed her for dragging Lucius Antonius into conflict, for antagonizing Octavian unnecessarily, and even for Antony's eventual estrangement from Rome and his turn toward Cleopatra. But were these accusations fair? Hardly. Fulvia had operated within a political climate where violence and manipulation were expected, at least if you were a man. She was no more ambitious than Caesar, no more aggressive than Pompey, no more ruthless than Octavian would eventually prove to be when he became Augustus. Her only true deviation was that she was a woman acting like a Roman man, and Rome did not know how to process that. She was not cloistered in the home, weaving quietly or serving as a political ornament while men made decisions. She was writing letters to generals, organizing street mobs, and commanding loyalty from troops who respected her effectiveness. And that made her dangerous, not just to Octavian, but to the entire structure of Roman memory-making. Even Mark Antony, the man whose legacy she had fought to preserve, conveniently blamed Fulvia for the civil strife after her death. After reconciling with Octavian and marrying his sister, Antony used Fulvia's death as a diplomatic cleansing. Her memory became the price of his political survival, the sacrifice he offered to seal his new alliance. There were no monuments raised in her honor, no grand funeral orations praising her achievements, no mourning speeches in the Senate. Just silence, and then slander, and then erasure. Yet her enemies could not erase her entirely. Fulvia had done too much, left too many marks on history to be completely disappeared. She had raised armies, steered elections, negotiated alliances, and fought a civil war. She was the first Roman woman whose name appeared on coinage, not as a deity or metaphor, but as a political agent in her own right. The damage to her reputation was deliberate, calculated, political. But so was her presence in the historical record. Despite every attempt to bury her behind caricature and slander, Fulvia refused to vanish entirely. Her defiance still echoes across the centuries. You just have to listen past the men who tried to silence her. Fulvia's story ends in silence, but her legacy is anything but quiet. In the centuries that followed her death, historians and writers struggled to place her in Rome's grand narrative because Fulvia broke every rule of what a Roman woman was supposed to be. She did not just advise power from the shadows, she became power, and that made her both unforgettable and deeply unsettling to a patriarchal world. In a society where women were expected to influence through whisper and marriage, Fulvia shouted through policy, war, and political theater. She was not a consort seeking to guide her husband's decisions. She was a commander making her own decisions and expecting others to follow. And yet she was remembered more for her defiance than her accomplishments. Roman historians could not handle a woman who did not stay in her place, so they rewrote her as shrill, power-hungry, and disruptive, the stock accusations leveled at ambitious women throughout history. They reduced her complexity to caricature, her achievements to aggression, her strategy to spite. But read between the lines of these hostile accounts, and a different figure emerges. Fulvia was the first Roman woman to mint coins with her name, placing herself alongside the men who ruled the Republic. She organized political factions with skill that professional politicians might envy. She leveraged marriage as a tactical weapon, building alliances that shaped the course of civil wars. She manipulated Roman street politics with stunning effectiveness, understanding that power in the late Republic flowed through the mob as much as the Senate. She moved through the civil wars of the 1st century BCE not as a bystander but as a player, a woman whose influence terrified senators and shaped the fate of triumvirs. Her downfall was not due to incompetence or excessive ambition. It was due to timing and gender. Had she been born a man, she might have been remembered as a second Caesar or a more effective Cato. Instead, she was cast as the wicked woman who dared too much. Still, her legacy quietly lingered. Later Roman women like Livia Drusilla, Agrippina the Younger, and even Cleopatra herself, though of a different world, would all operate in the shadow Fulvia helped carve. They would manipulate emperors, wield influence over armies, and control succession through strategic marriages and careful politics. But Fulvia did it first, and with no imperial title to shield her from criticism. Today, modern historians have begun re-examining Fulvia with fresh eyes. No longer content with the ancient caricature, they are recognizing her as one of the most politically active women in Roman history, someone who tested the boundaries of female power and paid the price for her audacity. She did not simply live in the age of triumvirs. She challenged them, confronted them, made them reckon with her presence. And while Rome may have tried to erase her, Fulvia left fingerprints in every corner of its collapse. Not a footnote to the careers of the men she married, but a force in her own right. A woman centuries ahead of her time, and a warning about what happens to those who step too far outside the boundaries drawn for them. By the summer of 1963, the United States was a country teetering between two worlds, one rooted in centuries-old systems of oppression, and another aching to breathe free. In the Deep South, segregation was not just a social norm but the law, enforced by police, courts, and the casual violence of those who believed in white supremacy. Black Americans were barred from restaurants, schools, buses, voting booths, and even drinking fountains by laws that carried the full weight of government authority. Police brutality was rampant, unchecked, and often celebrated by white communities who saw it as maintaining order. Lynching still occurred, though less frequently than in earlier decades, and in places like Birmingham, Alabama, peaceful protesters were being met with snarling police dogs and high-pressure fire hoses that could strip bark from trees. But change was coming, and it was not asking for permission. In just a few years, the civil rights movement had surged into the national spotlight. Sit-ins at segregated lunch counters had spread across the South, with young black students risking arrest and violence to demand service. Freedom rides had challenged segregated interstate buses, drawing federal attention to local violence. boycotts had shown the economic power of organized black communities. Leaders like Rosa Parks, Medgar Evers, and John Lewis were no longer just names in newspapers, they were symbols of defiance, living proof that ordinary people could resist extraordinary oppression. The March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom was not born out of a single conversation or a moment of inspiration. It was the result of rising frustration and fierce hope, of years of organizing and decades of dreams deferred. Black Americans were no longer content with waiting for change to arrive at the pace white society found comfortable. They were demanding civil rights immediately, and they were determined to make their voices heard where it mattered most, the nation's capital. The idea of a mass march in Washington, D.C., had been floating around for decades. Philip Randolph, a labor organizer and longtime civil rights advocate, had originally proposed the concept in the 1940s. Back then, it was meant to pressure the Roosevelt administration to desegregate the defense industry, which was excluding black workers from well-paying jobs even as the nation prepared for war. That protest was called off after Roosevelt caved and signed an executive order, proving that mass pressure could produce results, but now, in 1963, the stakes were even higher. Segregation remained entrenched. Voting rights were systematically denied. Economic opportunity was a cruel joke for most black Americans. Randolph, along with other civil rights leaders including Bayard Rustin and Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., revived the vision of a march on Washington. And this time, they were not just marching for jobs. They were marching for dignity, for voting rights, for school desegregation, for equal pay, for the basic human right to live free of fear. The demands were economic as well as political, recognizing that freedom without resources was an empty promise. Over a dozen major civil rights organizations came together to plan the march, despite their many disagreements about tactics and strategy. They understood the power of a unified front, the importance of showing the nation and the world that the movement spoke with one voice on fundamental principles. The countdown had begun. Buses were being organized across the country. Flyers were spreading through churches, schools, and community centers. Word of mouth was moving faster than newspapers, carrying news of the march to every black community in America. And across the nation, black Americans were preparing for what would become one of the most unforgettable moments in American history. The dream was taking shape, one footstep at a time. Pulling off a protest of any kind in Washington, D.C., was no small feat in 1963. But planning one for over 100,000 people, possibly more, was logistical madness. On paper, it sounded like a nightmare of coordination and contingency planning. Food, water, transportation, sound systems capable of reaching hundreds of thousands, bathrooms for crowds larger than most cities, medical teams ready for any emergency, permits from a nervous district government, crowd control without police violence, safety plans that anticipated every possible disruption. And yet, somehow, they made it happen. At the center of this controlled chaos stood Bayard Rustin, a man who, despite being openly gay and often kept behind the scenes for political reasons, was a master strategist without equal in the movement. Rustin had once studied nonviolence directly under Mahatma Gandhi's followers in India, learning the philosophy and practice of peaceful resistance from those who had helped liberate a nation. He had marched, been jailed, beaten, and surveilled by the FBI for his activism and his identity. But nothing fazed him. Rustin saw the March on Washington as a chance to show the world what disciplined, nonviolent protest could achieve when coordinated with military precision. He approached the logistics as a general plans a campaign, mapping routes, calculating capacities, training marshals, anticipating problems before they arose. In just 8 weeks, Rustin and his team transformed an idea into a reality. The march was officially called the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, deliberately framed to include both racial justice and economic opportunity. That dual message was no accident. It reflected the movement's understanding that civil rights without economic rights were incomplete, that freedom to sit at a lunch counter meant little without the money to buy a meal. While Dr. King would later become the spiritual symbol of the day, the face and voice that millions would remember, it was Randolph and Rustin who made sure the demands were just as much about unemployment, minimum wage, and workers' rights as they were about desegregation and voting. The march would demand not just the end of Jim Crow but the beginning of economic justice. Meanwhile, tensions simmered beneath the surface. President John F. Kennedy and his administration were nervous, deeply nervous. They feared riots, backlash, or worse, bloodshed that would discredit the movement and embarrass the nation before the world. Civil rights leaders assured them the protest would be peaceful, disciplined, and dignified. But assurances only went so far. The National Guard was placed on standby. Hospitals in D.C. were put on alert for mass casualties. Liquor sales were banned for the day to prevent alcohol-fueled incidents. Federal workers were told they could stay home if they were worried about safety. The city braced for the worst. And then there was the question of unity among the organizers. The Big Six civil rights organizations, the NAACP, CORE, SNCC, SCLC, the National Urban League, and Randolph's Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, often clashed over tactics and priorities. Some wanted more radical action, faster change, less compromise. Others preferred diplomacy and legislative pressure. SNCC's young firebrands were growing impatient with King's nonviolent approach, frustrated by the slow pace of change and the brutality they faced daily. But they all agreed on this: the time for silence had passed. The time for action had come. Rustin's plan read like a military operation. Every bus and train was tracked. Every speaker was timed to the minute, with strict limits enforced by stage managers. Every route had marshals trained in crowd control, wearing armbands that identified them as official representatives of the march. They were not just planning a protest. They were orchestrating a moment that would shake the conscience of a nation. August 28, 1963. A sweltering Wednesday in Washington, D.C. The sun was already hot by 9 a.m., and the humidity clung to the skin like a second shirt, promising an uncomfortable day for everyone who ventured outside. But it did not stop them. From every corner of the country, they came. Black, white, young, old. Students who had skipped classes and risked expulsion. Clergy in their clerical collars, bearing witness to their faith's demands for justice. Factory workers who had taken unpaid leave. Sharecroppers who had saved for months to afford the bus fare. Celebrities whose presence drew camera crews and reporters. They wore their Sunday best, suits and dresses, hats and polished shoes, as if attending church rather than a protest. They clutched signs with simple messages: jobs and freedom, now, we march together. Some sang freedom songs learned in movement meetings. Others walked in silence, absorbing the magnitude of what they were part of. They came by bus, train, carpool, and on foot. Over 250,000 people in total, converging on the National Mall like a rising tide of hope that no authority could hold back. And yet, there was no chaos. Despite the government's fear of riots and unrest, despite the heat and the crowds and the potential for disaster, the scene was astonishingly calm. Volunteers directed foot traffic with quiet efficiency. The Red Cross handed out water to prevent heat exhaustion. Groups sang together, held hands, and cheered as new marchers arrived, swelling the crowd ever larger. You could hear gospel choirs near the reflecting pool, their voices carrying across the water. You could hear chants of "Freedom Now" and "Jobs and Freedom" echoing off the marble columns of the Lincoln Memorial. You could hear the murmur of hundreds of thousands of conversations, a sound like the ocean made human. Celebrities joined the crowd: Harry Belafonte, Sidney Poitier, Paul Newman, Marlon Brando, Joan Baez, Bob Dylan. But no one was there for autographs or celebrity sightings. They were there to witness history, to lend their voices and their presence to a cause bigger than any individual. The crowd was orderly but energized, focused but joyful. There was no pushing, no looting, no violence, despite the fears of those who could not imagine so many black people gathering without chaos. Instead, there was a shared understanding that this was not just a protest. It was a sacred moment, a pilgrimage to the heart of the nation to demand what the nation had promised but never delivered. For many black Americans, just standing on the mall felt like a quiet act of revolution. To be seen in such numbers, to be counted, to be present at the seat of government demanding rights that should have been theirs from birth, it was a full-circle moment, generations in the making. Their grandparents had been enslaved. Their parents had lived under Jim Crow. And now they stood before the Lincoln Memorial, before the statue of the man who had signed the Emancipation Proclamation, demanding that its promises finally be kept. At exactly noon, the official program began. Leaders took the stage one by one, each representing different organizations, different ideologies, different regions of the country, but united in message. Speakers demanded equal pay, desegregated schools, a living wage, an end to police brutality. Mahalia Jackson sang, her voice rising above the crowd like a prayer made audible. Marian Anderson, who had once been banned from singing at Constitution Hall because of her race, now sang for thousands beneath the open sky, her voice carrying across the same city that had once rejected her. As the hours passed, the tension grew, not from unrest or fear, but from anticipation. The man everyone was waiting for had not yet spoken. And when he did, the world would stop, listen, and remember. The march was not just making history. It was becoming legend, minute by minute. By mid-afternoon, the crowd had grown quiet. Not because they were tired, though many had been standing for hours in the heat, but because they knew what was coming. The anticipation was palpable, electric, a charge in the air that had nothing to do with the weather. Standing in the shade of the Lincoln Memorial, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. approached the podium. He wore a dark suit, a neatly tied tie, and an expression of deep calm that barely concealed the fire building inside him. He carried prepared remarks, typed and written collaboratively with his advisors the night before, a careful, measured speech that addressed the major themes of the march. But what the world would remember was not what had been typed. It was what came from his heart. He began with measured intensity, outlining the grim realities of segregation, police violence, and broken promises. 100 years later, he said, referring to the Emancipation Proclamation, the Negro is still not free. His voice rose and fell like a sermon, using rhythms learned in black churches across the South. He used repetition, building momentum with each phrase. He used silence not as empty space but as an instrument, letting key words hang in the air before continuing. The crowd listened in rapt attention. Some nodded, affirming each point. Others wiped away tears, moved by words that spoke their experience. Others held signs that simply said, "Now," capturing the urgency of the moment. But it was what happened next that changed everything. Standing just behind King was gospel legend Mahalia Jackson, who had sung earlier in the program. She knew King well, had traveled with him, understood his rhythms and his gifts. As he approached the end of his prepared remarks, she suddenly cried out, "Tell them about the dream, Martin. Tell them about the dream." And King did. He set aside his notes, gripped the podium, and launched into a passage. He had delivered before in smaller settings but never like this, never to 250,000 people, never with the eyes of the nation and the world upon him. "I have a dream," he said, and the crowd leaned in, hungry for what would come next. "I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed." Each phrase rang louder, clearer, more resolute than the last. "I have a dream that one day on the red hills of Georgia, the sons of former slaves and the sons of former slave owners will be able to sit down together at the table of brotherhood." The crowd began to respond, calling out encouragement, swept up in the vision he was painting. "I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin but by the content of their character." It was not a speech anymore. It was a vision, a prayer, a lightning bolt through history. King was not just speaking, he was prophesying. calling forth a future that did not yet exist but that he could see with perfect clarity. By the time he closed with the words, "Free at last. Free at last. Thank God Almighty, we are free at last," the crowd erupted. Applause, tears, shouts of joy, hands raised in praise. They knew they had just witnessed something more than oratory. They had heard prophecy, seen a vision of what America could become. The power of the March on Washington was not just in the speeches or the music or the organization. It was in the people, the 250,000 souls who had gathered to witness and participate, who would carry that vision back to their communities and continue the work. They had seen the dream. Now they had to make it real. The March on Washington was historic for many reasons, but perhaps most fundamentally because of the people who made it happen. They came from Mississippi, where registering to vote could cost you your life. From Michigan, where northern segregation was subtler but no less real. From Alabama, where Bull Connor's dogs and fire hoses had become symbols of brutal resistance to change. From New York, California, and everywhere in between. Some were seasoned activists who had marched a dozen times before, been arrested, beaten, jailed, and returned to march again. They carried the scars of the movement on their bodies and in their memories. Others had never left their hometowns until now, had never seen so many people gathered for a single purpose, had never imagined themselves part of something so large. They packed lunches of fried chicken and biscuits, rode buses for over 20 hours, and slept in their church clothes just to be there at dawn. They came despite the heat, despite the fears, despite everything that told them they should stay home and stay safe. Many were ordinary people, maids who cleaned white women's houses, teachers who educated black children in segregated schools, steel workers who labored in dangerous mills, postal clerks who sorted mail day after day. They did not see themselves as political figures or historical actors. They saw themselves as witnesses, as participants, as people who had waited long enough for change to arrive on its own. But they did not just want change. They were the change, the living embodiment of the movement's power and reach. Their presence in Washington, their willingness to travel and gather and demand, was itself a political act of the highest order. There were also children in the crowd, young black girls with ribbons in their hair, boys with hand-drawn signs clutched in small hands. Parents hoisted toddlers onto their shoulders so they could see the Lincoln Memorial in the distance and hear the speakers' voices carried over loudspeakers. To these children, this was not just an event. It was the beginning of a new world, the first day of the rest of their lives. Some faces stood out from the crowd. There was young John Lewis, just 23 years old, representing the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC. His original speech had been so fiery, so uncompromising in its critique of the federal government's failure to protect civil rights workers, that older leaders asked him to tone it down minutes before he went on stage. He agreed, barely. His call for radical change still shook the crowd, reminding everyone that the young people of the movement would not wait forever. And then there was Daisy Bates, the only woman to speak that day, not on her own behalf, but reading a prepared statement on behalf of other civil rights women. The organizers had faced criticism for sidelining female voices, for excluding women from the main speaking slots despite their crucial roles in the movement. Bates's brief but powerful message underscored a harsh reality: even within a movement about equality, some voices still struggled to be heard. Also present were union organizers, rabbis, nuns, priests, and students of every background. They did not all agree on strategy. Some favored King's nonviolence, others leaned toward Malcolm X's more militant posture. But for that one day, those differences did not matter. Unity won out. It was a visual symphony of American possibility, white and black hands linked in solidarity, freedom now, buttons pinned to chests, the sound of 250,000 souls breathing as one. The faces in the crowd were not just watching history unfold. They were shaping it. And none of them would ever forget what they saw. While the world saw unity, inspiration, and poetic justice on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, behind the scenes the March on Washington was anything but simple. What looked like a perfectly synchronized movement was in truth held together with string, sweat, and a lot of last-minute compromise. Bayard Rustin, the chief architect of the march, had to battle not just logistics but politics at every turn. He was constantly under scrutiny, not just because he was openly gay and a former communist, but because some civil rights leaders feared his identity would be used to discredit the entire movement. In fact, Congressman Adam Clayton Powell had once threatened to publicly accuse Rustin and Dr. King of being lovers if King did not remove Rustin from an earlier campaign. That threat haunted every stage of planning, forcing Rustin to work behind the scenes while others took public credit. Then there was the issue of women's voices in the movement. Despite the critical roles played by women like Ella Baker, Diane Nash, and Dorothy Height, women who had organized, strategized, and risked their lives for years, none were invited to deliver major speeches on their own behalf. Rosa Parks was in the crowd that day, revered by all as the mother of the movement. But she was not given the microphone. Behind the powerful optics of the march lay an uncomfortable truth: the movement still struggled with its own hierarchies and blind spots. The same people demanding equality from white society sometimes failed to practice it among themselves. Women who had done the hard work of organizing were pushed aside when cameras appeared. Gay leaders like Rustin were kept in the shadows despite their essential contributions. Even within the Big Six organizations, friction bubbled beneath the surface. SNCC leaders were growing increasingly disillusioned with the slow pace of change and the older generation's insistence on moderation. They wanted to confront systemic racism more aggressively, to challenge not just segregation but the entire structure of American inequality. CORE had similar frustrations, its members tired of being beaten and arrested while politicians promised change that never came. But unity was deemed too important to sacrifice for that one day. The organizers knew that the nation was watching, that any sign of division would be exploited by opponents of civil rights. So they papered over their differences, agreed to disagree, and presented a united front to the world. Meanwhile, the federal government watched with clenched teeth. J. Edgar Hoover's FBI had assigned over 100 agents to spy on the organizers, bugging hotel rooms, following key figures, compiling dossiers on anyone associated with the march. They were convinced the event would turn violent, or that communists would hijack it for their own purposes. When nothing of the sort happened, when the march proved peaceful, dignified, and overwhelmingly patriotic in its demands, they simply doubled down on their surveillance, especially of Dr. King. And let us not forget money. The march cost over $250,000, equivalent to millions today. Most of it was raised through unions and sympathetic donors, but organizers scrambled until the final hour, never quite sure they would meet their budget. They even borrowed walkie-talkies from the Boy Scouts because they could not afford to buy their own. The March on Washington was historic, yes. But it was also deeply human, imperfect, messy, political, and unfinished. Just like the country it sought to heal. The sun began to dip behind the Washington Monument as the crowd slowly dispersed. People hugged, cried, sang, and lingered as long as they could, reluctant to leave what felt like sacred ground. But the march was over. The speeches had been delivered. The signs had been raised high. The world had watched. And now the question hung heavy in the humid August air: what happens next? In the immediate days that followed, the media reaction was cautiously positive. Major newspapers acknowledged the historic nature of the event, though often with a tone of detached curiosity. Some called it orderly and dignified code, in the language of the time, for no one rioted. Few outlets gave much space to the specific demands of the march, like the call for a federal jobs program or a $2 minimum wage, equivalent to around $20 today. But everyone covered Dr. King's speech. That at least could not be ignored. President John F. Kennedy, who had initially opposed the idea of the march, watched it unfold on television with growing admiration and perhaps surprise. He called the event impressive and met with civil rights leaders at the White House immediately afterward. But legislative movement remained slow. His proposed Civil Rights Act was still stalled in Congress, caught in the clutches of Southern opposition that used every parliamentary tool to delay, dilute, and defeat it. Some activists were disappointed. They had hoped the march would result in immediate action, laws passed, segregation ended, justice delivered. Instead, it was back to the grind, organizing, marching, resisting, and mourning those who paid the price for demanding freedom. Just weeks later, that reality hit home with devastating force. On September 15, 1963, 4 black girls were killed in the 16th Street Baptist Church bombing in Birmingham, Alabama. Addie Mae Collins, Cynthia Wesley, Carol Robertson, and Carol Denise McNair, aged 11 to 14, died when a bomb planted by white supremacists exploded during Sunday services. The dream had been voiced, yes. But the nightmare was not over. Still, something had changed. The March on Washington marked a new phase in the civil rights movement. It proved that mass protest could be disciplined, powerful, and impossible to ignore. It brought together a coalition broader than ever before: labor unions, faith leaders, celebrities, students, and working-class Americans, all in one place, united by justice. And most of all, it gave the movement a voice, a dream, a speech that would be quoted, studied, and echoed across the world for generations to come. The march was over, but the road was just beginning. And that road would soon lead through blood, legislation, and transformation, through the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, and all the battles that followed. The dream had been spoken. Now it had to be lived. The March on Washington did not just rattle the conscience of America. It reshaped its moral landscape, creating a new standard against which the nation would be judged. What had begun as an audacious act of protest became a cornerstone of the civil rights movement's legacy, permanently altering how Americans understood justice, democracy, and the power of collective action. In legislative terms, the march did not yield immediate victories. But it created momentum, a sense that change was not just possible but inevitable, that the nation was finally ready to confront its oldest sin. Less than a year later, in July 1964, President Lyndon B. Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act into law. It outlawed segregation in public places and banned employment discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, or national origin, the most sweeping civil rights legislation since Reconstruction. And in 1965, the Voting Rights Act followed, striking at the very heart of Jim Crow by prohibiting the literacy tests, poll taxes, and other devices used to deny Black Americans the right to vote. Federal examiners could now register voters where local officials refused. The balance of power in the South began to shift. Would these bills have passed without the march? Possibly. But would they have had the same moral force, the same undeniable public pressure behind them? Probably not. The march put the nation on notice that Black Americans would no longer accept second-class citizenship, and that white Americans who believed in justice could no longer remain silent. For Martin Luther King Jr., the speech that day propelled him into a new realm. He went from respected leader to global icon, from civil rights activist to moral conscience of the nation. But fame came with a cost. The FBI intensified its surveillance, its harassment, its attempts to destroy him. Death threats multiplied. The pressures of leadership grew heavier with each passing year. King would be assassinated in 1968, shot on a balcony in Memphis while supporting striking sanitation workers. He was 39 years old. The dream he had spoken of on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial became more poignant, more tragic, and more revered with each passing year, a vision of what America could be, and a measure of how far it still had to go for the broader movement. The march showed what unity could achieve. It gave organizers a blueprint for large-scale mobilization, demonstrating that disciplined protest could capture national attention without descending into chaos. It inspired a generation of activists both in the United States and abroad, anti-apartheid organizers in South Africa, student protesters in Europe, human rights advocates across the globe who saw in the March on Washington a model of effective, peaceful resistance. But the legacy is not just historical. The language of the march, the idea of jobs and freedom, the image of peaceful resistance. The echoes of "I Have a Dream" still pulses through modern protest movements. From the Million-Man March to Black Lives Matter rallies, the echoes of 1963 reverberate with every chant, every march, every cardboard sign held high in Washington, D.C. King's Memorial now stands just across the tidal basin from the Lincoln Memorial. Visitors walk past his towering likeness carved in stone, with words from that August day etched into the granite. But the real memorial is not in stone. It is in classrooms where children learn about the march. In voting booths where Black Americans exercise rights won through struggle. In marches where new generations demand that the dream finally be fulfilled. Because the dream was not meant to rest in history books. It was meant to be lived. And the legacy of that summer afternoon still dares us to do just that. More than 60 years have passed since that summer afternoon when over 250,000 people stood shoulder to shoulder beneath the shadow of the Lincoln Memorial. The March on Washington has been immortalized in textbooks, documentaries, and museum exhibits. Dr. King's speech is taught in schools, his words memorized by students who were not yet born when he spoke. His voice, steady and strong, echoes in national memory like a sacred refrain. But for many, the question remains, has the dream been realized, or has it merely been delayed? In some ways, progress is undeniable. The legal framework of segregation has been dismantled, Jim Crow laws repealed, separate facilities abolished, explicit discrimination prohibited by federal statute. Voting rights, though now under fresh assault in many states, were won through blood, marches, and court battles that transformed the political landscape of the South. The presence of Black lawmakers, judges, mayors, and even a two-term U.S. president was unthinkable in 1963. Interracial marriage, once illegal in much of the country, is now protected by federal law and accepted by an overwhelming majority of Americans. These are not small things. They are victories carved out by relentless struggle, by people who risked their lives to demand what should have been theirs from birth. And yet the original demands of the march, the ones often overshadowed by King's speech, the economic demands that Randolph and Rustin insisted on including, still echo unresolved. The call for a living wage remains unmet for millions of Americans. Racial disparities in education, housing, employment, and healthcare remain entrenched, passed down through generations like a bitter inheritance. Police brutality, the very thing that sparked much of the early civil rights organizing, continues to ignite outrage and protest in cities across the nation. The dream of true economic justice, of a country where opportunity is not predetermined by zip code or skin color, where the circumstances of your birth do not determine the trajectory of your life, is still far from reality. The wealth gap between Black and white Americans has barely narrowed since 1963. The school-to-prison pipeline funnels Black youth into incarceration at rates that would have shocked even the activists of the 1960s. Housing segregation persists, reinforced by policies and practices that maintain the old boundaries. Modern movements like Black Lives Matter have taken up the mantle, often using the imagery and rhetoric of the 1963 march as both inspiration and indictment. They march through the same cities, chant on the same streets, demand the same basic human rights that were demanded 60 years ago. But they do so in a world transformed by social media, by surveillance technology, by new forms of resistance and new strategies of suppression. The March on Washington was never meant to be the conclusion. It was a flashpoint, a stake in the ground that said, "This is who we are, and this is what we demand." It was a declaration, not a resolution. So the dream remains, battered, challenged, reinterpreted, but still alive. Whether it is deferred, distorted, or one day fulfilled depends not on the past but on us. On the choices we make, the injustices we confront, the courage we summon to march again and again until the dream becomes a shared, lived reality for every American. The work is unfinished. The dream is still waiting. And the choice of what comes next belongs to each of us.